Central Illinois folks got up here, and we appreciate that. And we have some new Blue Coats also in the audience. Just a couple of things, do some introductions. We have John Petraka, Senior Managing Director of Course Rating, is in the back. We have Colin Perrone. I found out how to pronounce that this morning. He's the manager of Course Rating. And then some of the folks you're going to be working with, John Donofrio, who's the deputy chair and is a team leader in the south section up here. We have Steve Green, who is a team leader and in the northwest area. We have Mike Green, who is the immediate past chairman and a team leader in the northern suburbs. And glad to see that Mike Sullivan, team leader from Central Illinois, was able to make it here this morning. So thanks all you guys for getting here. I guess at this point in time, instead of listening to me for the next 90 minutes, introduce Scott Hovday from the USGA. He's the director. He's got a longer title than this, but he's basically the director of course rating. So Scott, if you're there, you can take over. And
sure.
Thank you for doing this for us.
Yeah, no worries, and always happy to help out. So what I was going to do is, I know there's a mixture of experienced people and some new people in the room. So I'm first going to cover the changes to the system for 2024, so the new people get an idea of what we've changed and maybe some rationale behind it. But then go over, the entire system kind of as an overview to kind of give everybody a baseline for how the system works. The beginner people, obviously, this will be just a very, we're not going to teach how to rate a golf course in 2 hours, but for the experienced people, it's always good to do a refresher of, the system, so that when you get started rating here in the next, hopefully, few weeks, it's all comes back a lot quicker. So, all right. So we did update the system in 2024. So we do have brand new books. Hopefully everybody in the room or everybody that will be rating here this year has a new book. We don't want to use the old books, obviously, but we didn't have a ton of changes this year, but enough that, we want to make sure that you're aware of those. So going through some of the key changes for the 2024 revision. And again, those people who are new, don't listen too hard on this, because you're going to learn a little bit more about the actual, how the system works in general, here in about 15 minutes after I cover this. So one thing is under definitions, we italicized any term in the book that has a definition. So when you see a term that it's italicized, you know that there's a place you can go look up what that actually means. So as the example here shows, are present near the fairway landing zone. Both near and landing zone are a definition. So the word near sounds like a very mundane word, like nothing special, but it actually has a definition. So it's good to know that there's a definition for that. Also, under does not exist. This is a change. We added that you have the ability to ignore an obstacle that's within that 50-yard window, which normally we say anything within 50 yards of the line of play, center of the green, any direction is existing, and it has to be rated as a 1. We give the opportunity to, to give it a 0 if it's extremely unlikely to come into play. So as you can see in the image here, the shot's kind of coming from the top of the picture down towards the green. So that water, that penalty area that's over the green, right at 50 yards, the player going over a bunker, there's a cart path there, yes, but basically they have to hit the ball 50 yards past the green to really have a chance to get into it. Probably unlikely that's ever going to come into play. So it's given given everybody the discretion to kind of give a 0 when they feel like it's just too far away for it to really come into play, even though it might be within that 50-yard window. This is typically going to happen on an obstacle over the green, but it could be left and right. Maybe it's up a steep hill where it's it's 49 yards to a out of bounds stake, but it's a 40-foot rise on a hill to get up there. So the player really couldn't get there even on a really bad shot. So transition zone, we did change the transition zone procedure. Really, we just removed the plus or minus 1 option from using the transition zone rating value. So essentially, once a hole's in transition, once it's determined to be in transition, you're going to be using that bottom row of the course of the green target table, the 4s, the 5s, and the 6s. There's really no plus or minus 1 anymore, just to make it a little bit more simple, a little bit more consistent. We're going to cover transition a little bit later as well. Under measuring, we really want to make sure that courses are accurately measured and up to date. So we do say that a course rating or a course measurement is valid for 10 years. So each time a course is re-rated, if it's not within that 10-year window, hole lengths must be either validated prior to or during the rating. Sometimes courses change without, the people even realizing it, whether it's staff has turned over a couple times and people didn't realize they've moved tees up or removed tees, et cetera. So it's always good to make sure that those measurements are accurate and up to date. And then we did add some guidance on how to handle things such as false fronts. When we measure a hole, we're going to include the false front when determining the center of the green. We had talked about not including it at some point, but it's just too subjective. Some people might be 2 yards, 3 yards, 5 yards, 8 yards onto the green, and we really don't want that inconsistency there. So we're basically going to just include it for the measurement of the green. However, for the measurement of the hole, but however, for the rating itself, when we're looking at the effective green diameter, we can take that false front out of the mix in terms of determining the green size. So little inconsistent, but we felt like it was the better way to do it than try to have course measurements done with a false front kind of being subjective. Also, we added guidance that the system is most accurate when rating tees that best fit the shot lengths for the scratch and the bogey players. So we really want the tees for the men between 6,000 and 6,500 to be the base tees that are rated, by the book for all 18 holes. And then for women between 5,000 and 5,500. Basically, we can replicate tees outside those ranges, which means we're basically just copying the obstacles, but just adding the difference in yardage. However, we want to make sure that that tee that's primarily rated is in that range if possible. It's at the bottom. If no tee falls within that range, see clarifications. Some courses aren't even this long. You might have a course that the back tee is only 5,200 yards. So for men, obviously you can't find one between 6,000 and 6,500. So there is some additional guidance in the manual, but we really want the system to work best. And by picking yardages in this range, it's going to do so. And with replication, we still allow replication to be done up to 25 yards per tee from a book rated tee. However, those extremely long tees, the 7,000 plus yards for men, 6,000 for women, can be fully replicated. You don't even have to do any additional obstacle ratings for those tees. We're just doing a full yardage replication. However, on the shorter side, the 4,800 yards for men or 4,000 for women, those have some additional considerations. So there's a clarification in the course rating system manual about replicating below 4,800 or 4,000, mainly because these become short courses, which we do still allow the replication, but there's some additional guidance for the shorter end of replication, just because we have the new shorter course formulas that we want to make sure aren't being replicated from a longer set of tees. All right, next slide here. Roll. We basically changed roll where we used to say roll was assumed to be between 15 and 25 yards. We've changed that to just say it's an average of 20 yards. The problem there was that we typically adjust for roll when it becomes plus or minus 5. But from a 20-yard average, if you go up or down 5, you're still within the 15 to 25. So we just wanted to make sure that a 5-yard increase or decrease in roll qualified for an adjustment. So the 20 being the standard or being the average, it allows us to do that. So forced layups and layup by choice criteria for women from 13 yards to 15 yards. So it matches the men. So essentially, anytime there's a less than 15-yard wide area between, a severe obstacle, it's going to be a forced layup for both men and women, as opposed to having a separate value for women, just for consistency, for simplicity, and just to make sure people aren't having to worry about confusion. Also under layup by choice, which we don't tend to use very often, but we did add some additional guidance to say a layup by choice would be when a significant obstacle or combination of obstacles in or adjacent to the normal landing zone results in a player choosing to hit less than a full shot. It can no longer be just because of a course management decision. So we don't want people laying up by choice just to have a full shot to the green. So if the fairway's 30 yards wide and they're hitting the ball down to 60 yards, we're not going to have a problem with that. We don't need to lay them back at 80 or 100 just to give them a full swing on a club. So essentially, we're trying not to use layup by choice unless it's some sort of obstacle that the player might choose to lay up because just to stay out of. So topography. The only thing we did here was we added text in the top row of the table that says or shot from landing zone to landing zone. This is not a change in the system. We've always instructed to use that top row of the table when you're hitting a shot from one landing zone to another landing zone. But a lot of people were using the other rows based on the elevation change between landing zone to landing zone. So just want to make sure that people were clear that Anytime a shot is being hit from one landing zone to another, not to the green itself, we use that top row of the table for your topography values. Fairway, we modified the table a bit. We put the women on the left and the men on the right, just again for consistency. Most of the tables have the men's values on the right, the women on the left. So we didn't want one table to have that opposite, so people would potentially get on the wrong side. But also we kind of highlighted those two columns, men and women, to be a little bit more clear that women are in the gold, men are in the blue, which is consistent with throughout the rest of the book. The second thing we did here in the table is we changed the less than 20 column header to 0 to 19. Very small change, and again, shouldn't change your ratings, but we had a lot of people who didn't realize that 0 is a number, meaning that if the fairway is 0, I mean, there is no fairway, you still go to the table, you still use that far right-hand column. So we had a lot of raters who thought with a 0, you would give it a max value, or you would, give it a 10 or something like that. You still use the table, and 0 to 19 is a legitimate value. So 0 is still a value in the table. Under green target, we reduced the table. It's quite a bit smaller than the previous tables. We went from 12 rows to 9 rows. So there's fewer numbers in the table, but slightly larger ranges on the shot lengths. Really, the numbers themselves didn't change a whole lot in terms of only about 10% of the time would a value be different than it would have been before. But it does make the table a little bit easier to use, a little bit more consistent with the values. We also stacked the tables on top of each other, so they're a little easier to read in the book, as opposed to being left and right, where you had to open the book 100% open to see both tables, when now you can just kind of peek it open a little bit and see them. And under the firm adjustment, we removed the reference to the scratch golfer. It used to say if a green is unusually firm, example given, a well-struck shot by the scratch golfer will frequently bounce over the green. A lot of people assumed that you couldn't apply this to the bogey golfer because it didn't reference the bogey. That was not the intention, so we removed the reference to the scratch golfer. Essentially, a firm green is a firm green, whether it's for a scratch golfer or a bogey golfer. It will apply to both. Under R&R, we combined the tables. We used to have 2 separate tables for men and women. We combined them into one. So now you come in from the bottom row for the women, and you come in from the top row for the men, just to kind of keep the table a little smaller and free up some space on the rest of the page. But we also added a column that's specific to 2-inch cool season rough, which would be the same as 1-inch warm season. Obviously, you don't have any warm season rough. You're rating there in Chicago. So, but the 2-inch is a very common column. A lot of courses maintain the rough at 2 inches. So we wanted to make sure we had a column that really reflected that. The old table, you had to use a tweener. Basically, you had a up to 2 or less than 2, and then 2 to 3, and didn't have a column exactly for 2. So this just allows you to use a number without having to use a tweener value. We also, under R&R, added a new extreme adjustment, which allows you to add a point to R&R when you have something that's a punitive feature that is really not rated in other parts of the book, such as a stone wall, boulders, integral part of the golf course, really anything that would result in extremely difficult recovery shots. And again, this punitive feature must not have been rated under another obstacle. So we're just seeing more and more courses that are putting stuff on the golf course that typically don't there, or normally aren't there, I should say, like fences and rocks and things like that, or they're leaving rock outcroppings in the middle of the fairway. We really want to have the ability to give those additional rating points since they're not really rated somewhere else in general. And then we removed the unpleasant adjustment within the R&R page. However, we rolled that concept into the inconsistent adjustment. So basically, when you have extensive areas of hard pan that closely border the green and then create unpleasant recovery issues, you just use the inconsistent +1 adjustment, as opposed to having a separate adjustment U that required another line of text on the page. So the R&R page is probably the busiest page in the entire course rating book. So we wanted to make it a little bit smaller, easier to manage. And then this one actually is a pretty significant change. It'll require a lot of people to really be aware that this is a change, which is for fairway bunkers. For the bogey golfer, we're going to use the same criteria as we do for the scratch, meaning that those fairway bunkers have to be near the bogey landing zone to count as a fairway bunker. The system counted any fairway bunker along the line of play, from the tee all the way to the green, as a fairway bunker. But we have reasons for this. One is that we got some complexities when you get bunkers near the green that kind of stretch back 5 yards, 10 yards, 15 yards. When do they become fairway bunkers? When do they just remain as greenside bunkers? But also, we've added so many points over the years to the bogey golfer in terms of additional rating values for bunkers, for R&R, et cetera. We really don't need to continue to add points for a bunker that might exist, 50 yards off the tee or 100 yards away from a landing zone. So really, the same criteria as for scratch and bogey. A bunker must be within the near category, within 20 yards of a landing zone to count as a fairway bunker. So hopefully that makes it actually easier because you don't have to worry about a separate criteria for scratch and bogey. And the last thing we really made an update for 2024 was to address oddly shaped greens, specifically square greens. These have become much more common, especially with redesigns. We rated a course last year in Michigan for one of our national seminars that had 18 greens that were square or squarish. So we really had to make sure people were aware of how to handle those. So we added a clarification in the course rating manual about how to determine the effective diameter for a square or partially squared off green. Essentially what it says is that you still use your width and your depth, but consider increasing the green size if you're near a break point. Because as you can see in these images, if you take a width and a depth measurement, you're kind of missing a lot of that green surface that exists kind of in those corners. So the green's a little bit bigger than a circle would indicate. So we allow you to kind of increase that green size, again, if it's near a break point. So if it's 25 or 25 and a half average, and 26 is the break point, it'd probably be a good idea to go up to 26 as your diameter. So really, we're just kind of rounding up or adding an extra yard of effective diameter in those cases. Okay, now I'm going to go into kind of a basic overview of the system. For the newer people in the room, people who are brand new to rating, this will be kind of an overview of the system, how it's designed to work, etc. But for those who are experienced, it's always good to do a refresher and kind of make sure that you understand the basics of the system before you get started on another season of rating here. So just as a basic introduction, the course rating system is designed to determine the playing difficulty of a golf course for scratch and higher handicap golfers, typically bogey golfers, during mid-season conditions. So we do rate courses based on mid-season conditions, not necessarily the day it's being rated. So if you rate a golf course in April or even, sometimes October, November, where the leaves are off the trees, the rough is not the same as it would be in midseason, you want to basically treat it as if it were midseason and use those values. Also, to determine the playing difficulty of a golf course relative to all other rated courses. A course rating is not just specific to a single golf course. It's designed to be part of a system where it's relative to all the other courses that are rated, in a region, in a country, all over the world, essentially. And then also it enables handicaps to be portable from course to course anywhere in the world. So the rating system really allows somebody to take their handicap index, play at a golf course, get the appropriate number of strokes, and then when they post a score, that handicap differential will be used to determine their, handicap index update. So as it says at the bottom, as a course rater, you want to be both accurate and consistent. Accurate meaning you're measuring things accurately, you're reading the tables accurately, obviously, but consistent as well. Don't treat courses differently because you know them or you've played them before and you've struggled there. We really want you to use this system as objectively as possible. And like I said, a course rating or course and slope rating provide the player with the required number of strokes they need to play a golf course. So these are basically what course rating is about, why we need it. It's really to support the handicap system. So this shot length table is essentially what we use for determining landing zones. This table's been used for quite a long time, and some people, usually raise their hand and say, "Is this outdated, or are we a little bit low on these numbers?" We actually aren't. We've actually done a lot of research the last 10 or 15 years, and while they're the elite players, the really good players are definitely much longer than these numbers. The typical club scratch golfer, the typical bogey golfer, close enough to these numbers that we're not in a rush to change any of these values. But as you can see, there's a lot of numbers in this table, but really there's 4 different golfers represented here. There's the scratch male, the bogey, scratch male and bogey male, and then there's the female scratch and the female bogey. So there's 4 different golfers represented. So really each column represents a single golfer. So for example, the scratch golfer for men, we assume a 230-yard carry, 20 yards of average roll for a total of 250, and then additional shots beyond that, 200 yards of carry plus 20 yards of roll for 220. So that's what gets us to the 470 2-shot distance. And then as you can see, the women, the bogey male and female as well, they just have some similar numbers, but obviously a little bit shorter. So what that means is that we have landing zones, and these landing zones are where we expect players to be on their shots. We have a 20-yard deep landing zone because that's the normal roll that the player gets. We're assuming the player lands and gets about 20 yards to roll. So those landing zones are 20 yards deep accordingly. So as you can see here, this is the scratch golfer's expected landing zones. Tee shot there near those bunkers to the right. Second shot, again, near some more bunkers, etc. And then for the bogey, in this case, we have landing zones that are a little bit further back. They're not as far as the scratch because they don't hit the ball as far. So you can see the bogey golfer's second landing zone is really not near any of those bunkers. So really, in that case, you might get a lower bunker rating for bogey than scratch in this hole because scratch has bunkers closer to both landing zones than the bogey. So this is kind of the whole concept of course rating, is we're evaluating landing zones, what obstacles exist near those landing zones, which could cause the player to have trouble. So most of the time spent on the golf course doing ratings is at the areas between those landing zones. While we still acknowledge them, especially if there's crossings or things that have to be carried, we really don't focus on those areas that are not in the expected landing zones. So what is assessed when rating a golf course? We essentially look at 6 different things that it can impact length of the course or length of a hole, which the first one is obviously the measured length of the hole itself. And then we look at things such as roll, elevation, dog leg or forced layup adjustments, wind and altitude. And then we have 10 different obstacle factors that we factor in as well. And you can see them from topography down to psychological. So there's a lot of work on the golf course when you're rating. Most courses don't have all of these in play on every hole. It's pretty rare to have, all the obstacles and all the measured, effective playing length factors on a single hole. You might only have one. You might only have a hole with just roll, or you might have a hole with none. You may have a hole that's just flat and straight and there's no reason to adjust any length. And then as far as obstacles, same thing. You may have no trees, you may have no bunkers. So it's not common to have to obstacles. So as a summary, we rate obstacles on a 0 to 10 scale. This is kind of a basic summary of that, which 0 means it does not exist. But as I mentioned earlier in the changes to the system, it could still be a 0 if it exists, but it's determined to be significantly out of play or unlikely to come into play. But once an obstacle is determined to be generally there, it's gonna occasionally cause an issue with the player. We can give it a minimum rating of 1, and then it kind of goes up from there. As you can see, the number 4, the rating for 4 is of average significance. So this is kind of what we use as a average value in the system. So when you're rating a course that's pretty average, it's not exceptionally hard, it's not exceptionally easy, you're going to have a lot of ratings that are probably close to 4. 3s, 4s, and 5s, very common numbers in ratings, because those are kind of those just below average and just above average. So when you're rating a very difficult golf course, maybe like a Medina number 3 from the tips, you're probably going to get a lot of 6s and 9s and 10s, et cetera, because those are much more significant than average. So really, it should kind of make sense to the course you're rating. If you're rating a really easy course, you shouldn't see a lot of numbers above 5. If you're rating a really tough course, you're not going to see a lot of numbers below 3, other than for a handful of obstacles that may not be a problem. So like I mentioned earlier, we do have a 50-yard window left, right of the line of play and 50 yards beyond the center of the green. Anything within that box typically does exist, and we're going to give it a minimum rating of 1, with the exception where that obstacle is so unlikely to come into play, we can go ahead and give it a 0. All right, some key definitions, some things you should know as a course rater and know what those definitions are. First one is extreme rough, pretty common feature on a lot of courses, where they let the rough grow to an excessive height where it now becomes extreme, where the ball can potentially be lost or advanced only with great difficulty. So as you can see, we define it as cool season rough in excess of 6 inches for men or 5 inches for women. Those numbers in the braces, the little squiggly brackets there, those are warm season values, which you shouldn't have to worry about for the courses you guys are rating. So anytime I talk about rough today, I'll probably just focus on cool season. So 6 inches for men or 5 inches for women becomes extreme rough. The player might lose the ball, or if they can find it, they might have trouble advancing it. And then as you can see, there's other conditions, sand dunes, you don't have palmettos or ice plants typically, but tree roots, rocks, things that could make the ball either lost or advanced only with great difficulty. So extreme rough is essentially rated under either crossing obstacles or lateral obstacles, depending on where it comes into play, but also could be rated under recoverability in rough or bunkers, depending on where it's at and what it's made of. So Crossing obstacles. This is a full category in the course rating system, and we rate crossing obstacles. Essentially, those are penalty areas, extreme rough. Again, we don't have desert in Illinois, so don't worry about that. And then out of bounds when they must be carried to play the hole. So anytime a player has to cross over penalty areas, extreme rough, or out of bounds, we're going to have potentially a crossing obstacle value. You can actually get a 0 for a scratch golfer, even if they have to cross over an obstacle, if that crossing is so short that it really shouldn't impact that player. But for the bogey golfer, it's almost always going to be a 1 or greater. So the counter to that is lateral obstacles. So there's obstacles that have to be crossed over. And in this case, these are obstacles that are lateral. They exist on the left or the right of the fairway or left or the right of the green. Same general obstacles, though. Penalty areas, extreme rough, or out of bounds when they come into play laterally on the hole. So the same obstacle can be both lateral and crossing. So you could have a penalty area that's across the middle of the fairway, so the player has to cross over it, but then it continues on up the side of the fairway all the way to the green. And so that same penalty area could be a lateral obstacle as well. So, it's those three things: the penalty areas, the extreme rough, or the out of bounds, whether they're lateral or crossing, or in some cases, both. So not super common, but you will come across obstacle squeeze, where instead of having an obstacle just on one side of the hole, it actually exists on both sides of the hole, and the player cannot play away from either side. Essentially, the tables are assuming that there's an obstacle only on one side of the hole. So when you look at for example, a lateral obstacle table, it's going to say how far is the lateral obstacle from the middle of the fairway? It's 25 yards. Well, it's assuming it's just on one side. If it's on both sides, you could potentially have obstacle squeeze. So this only occurs in fairway landing zones. We don't use squeeze at the green because we assume players are going to the middle of the green or aiming at the green. On shots to the fairway, they might be able to play away from an obstacle by playing a little off the fairway or one side of the fairway or the other. So we're giving them a little bit higher rating in the fairway, but not at the green. And what we do is we give obstacle squeeze adjustment when the distance between lateral obstacles that borders both sides of the fairway is less than 40 yards. So it's got to be a pretty tight window to use this obstacle squeeze value. So if it was 25 yards to one side and 20 yards to the other side, it's more than 40 yards between them, we're not going to have an obstacle squeeze. It's got to get to be less than 20 to both sides, or basically 40 between them. And then for bunkers, we use the squeeze when the bunkers in the fairway get to be less than 30 yards between them, which is much more common. It's not uncommon to have a 25-yard wide fairway with fairway bunkers on both sides. And again, that's going to be it's going to be more difficult than if there was bunkers just on one side or the other. So all this is doing is adding an additional point, potentially 2 points, depending on how close those obstacles are to the center of the fairway. Another thing you won't see very often, but some courses have them, are tiered greens, where you have multiple plateaus for putting. So to be tiered, a green must have a minimum of 2 distinct plateaus of surface area, each with multiple hole locations. So the key is that these are 2 areas where players are going to be putting the ball from one tier to the other or within a tier. If it's just a little shelf, if it's just a single little shelf in the back of a green and there's maybe one hole location up there every once in a while, that's not a tiered green. It's got to be where the player is typically going to one tier or the other on a pretty routine basis. So that elevation change must cover a significant proportion of the green. So essentially, it can't just be like a small tier or a small ramp in the very back of the green. It's got to be a significant proportion of the green that has the different elevation changes, and that must be at least a 2-foot or greater elevation change, like I mentioned before. So when you have a tiered green, essentially we're going to increase green target ratings. Tiered green is a little bit more difficult to hit, not because it's smaller, but because the player's aiming typically to one side or the other. They're not necessarily aiming to the middle of the green. They're trying to get on the right tier. And then for green surface ratings for the bogey golfer, we increase ratings as well, because if they have to deal with that drop off, that steep slope between the tiers, that makes putting quite a bit more difficult, especially for the bogey golfer. And then another term we use quite a bit in course rating is tweener, not a something you're going to find in the dictionary, although maybe it is there now. But it's a value that falls in between 2 table values. Where some tables don't have every single number represented. So you might go from a value of 3 to a value of 5 from one category to the next. Doesn't mean you can't use the value between, which is the 4. So as you can see in the small image there on the left, if your fairway was 25 or 24 yards wide you're kind of jumping 2 points in the category. So if it's 25 yards wide, it's a 3, 24 yards wide, it's a 5. That might be a good time to use a 4 in that case. So really, anytime you see a 2-point jump in values, feel free to use the value between those if it's kind of right in that break point or pretty close to that break point between the two columns. Another thing about this system is that it doesn't differentiate the distance from the middle of the green in terms of direction. So when it says how far is, let's say, a penalty area from the middle of the green, whether it's left or right or over the green, you're going to get the same table value. So what we say is that when an obstacle exists behind the green, it's going to be generally less important than those of similar nature to the side or in front of the green. So what we do then is we say, reduce the value from the table when an obstacle exists behind the green by either using the -1 bounce adjustment, which says the ball is not likely to necessarily get over, or using the percentage adjustment, which allows you to take that table value down by a certain percentage. So essentially, we don't want you giving a full table value to an obstacle over the green in general, because the ball is typically not going to wind up over the green very often. As you can see in that first bullet point, only about 10% of shots wind up over the green. The other 90% are left, right, short, or right on it. So we do have a bunch of adjustments in the course rating system. This table, which is in the back inside cover of the book, of the guide, does have all the adjustments listed with the code that we use. Every adjustment has a code, which is a single letter or a number. So B, C, F, etc. And then it also gives you a table to the right that shows which obstacles those adjustments apply to, and a very brief description of it. This is just a summary table. All these adjustments are actually located in the obstacle that they apply to. So for example, the bounce adjustment, it says conditions cause the ball to bounce into or away from an obstacle, or obstacles only behind the green. You can see that that applies only to the lateral obstacles category, and the X to the right in the table. So really, obstacles table, you'll see the bounce adjustment as one of the potential adjustments to use. So again, no really need to reference this table while you're rating, because all these adjustments are in the appropriate page. So before a rating is done, there should be some preparation. If you go out to rate a golf course and the rating form you're handed is completely blank, you're going to be in for a very long day. You should at minimum have the hole lengths on the rating form. The measurement of the golf course should be done prior to the rating itself. So the hole lengths are going to be across the top. You have green dimensions that can sometimes be done ahead of time, whether it's by somebody doing the measuring, or maybe just somebody goes out there a few days in advance or a week in advance to do that. But some things can be carried over from previous ratings. So there's really no reason to remeasure, let's say, a crossing obstacle unless that tee is moved or the hole's changed length. Because if that second hole there, as you can see, it's a 140-yard hole, the crossing was 100 yards, it's pretty unlikely that they move the crossing obstacle. If it's a creek or a little pond or something like that, they're not going to move that. So the only way that that's going to change is likely if they move the tees around where the hole changes from 140 to 150 or something like that. So, but on the left side of this form, you can see that there's some information in the yellow that applies to the entire golf course, which is the rough type, which is cool or warm season. Again, you guys are probably going to be using cool season for 99% of your ratings. Rough height, 2¼ inch. That would be your average rough height for the course. What's the stimpmeter reading? What is the wind adjustment, if there is one? And then any altitude, which you don't have to worry about that as well. So these are things that are typically going to be done, on the golf course or at the beginning. You're not going to typically have these on your form before you get there, unless they're there just from a carryover from the last time where you just want to validate those. So if the rough was 2¼ inch last time, doesn't necessarily mean it's 2¼ inch this time, but you should at least validate that. So one thing that can be done ahead of time, if you have the hole lengths, is doing the approach shot length, which is that kind of that middle row under green target. Those are just mathematical approach shot lengths based on the length of the hole and the normal shot distances of those players. So if this is a rating for the men and the hole's 365 yards on hole 1, the scratch golfer should have an approach shot of 115 yards. The bogey should have an approach shot of 165 yards. Now, as you can see there below it, it says adjusted approach. There are going to be times when you have to adjust that value because of roll, layups, something that's basically not allowing the player to get to their full distance or giving them additional distance. So if they're hitting down a steep slope and they're getting an extra 15 yards of roll, that approach shot could be 15 yards shorter than the mathematical. So again, these are numbers that can be put in ahead of time, but they may be adjusted later. Measuring. Raters spend a lot of time measuring. So it's always good to have a laser. Laser is going to speed up your measuring. It's going to be much more accurate in general than pacing, but pacing is still a valid way of measuring, mostly for short distances. If you're measuring a narrow fairway, or you're measuring a bunker a fraction in terms of how much of the bunker borders the green, those can be done with pacing because you're talking about usually pretty short distances, but you obviously wouldn't want to use pacing to measure a 100-yard distance or a 200-yard distance. Those lasers are going to be your best friend. And you don't necessarily need a laser for every team member, but there should at least be some lasers within the team to share to get distances to obstacles and crossings, etc. So course rating is really mostly course measuring. And then there's some obviously adjustments and some, subjective decisions to have to be made. So on the Form 1, we call it the Form 1, but really it's the rating form. We rate for both a scratch and a bogey golfer. So we have to give it two values. We give it a scratch number, which is represented the value on the left, and then the bogey number in this case is on the right. So we have a 5 for scratch and a 7 for bogey. It's not always the case where the bogey rating is higher than scratch. While bogey golfers typically are going to have more trouble than scratch, there's obstacles that may exist more in play for the more in play for the scratch than for the bogey. So you may have heavy fairway bunkers near the the scratch landing zone, but very few, if any, near the bogey landing zone. So in that case, you might get a lower bogey rating than scratch. So it's not as common, probably less than half the time you're going to get a lower number for bogey, but again, it's not uncommon. So any questions so far?
No, nothing that's come through.
Okay.
Virtually.
Anything from the room or?
No.
Okay.
Wait,
So-
I might see a hand. Hold on. Colin, any questions out there?
Yeah, there's one question from
Sure.
the crowd asking sort of just a general list of things to bring along for the rating. Scott, do you want to touch on it? Otherwise, we've probably got a couple gentlemen
Yeah,
here
I mean,
to help answer
and
too.
you might have more what you guys recommend they bring, but typically a rating guide, obviously a laser, and then for the team, you need like a stimp meter, maybe an altimeter if you have a lot of elevation changes, which is not super common there where you guys are. But other than that, not a whole lot.
Oh, and where do we get the rating books?
We will have those. Yeah.
Okay. So we will continue on here. So now we're going to kind of go through the whole system and each obstacle, each effective playing length factor, just as an overview, how it works, how you rate it, and then some of the possible or some of the common adjustments you have. So like I said, there are these 5 different effective playing length factors. These are things that effectively make a hole longer or shorter than its measured length. Some of these you will probably never see. You don't have to really worry about altitude. Wind you may have. The good thing is wind is not rated on a hole-by-hole basis, but on a total course basis. But the first 3 of them, the roll, elevation, and dogleg force layup, those are rated on a. So roll, what we're doing is we're making an adjustment for roll on either par 4 or par 5 holes, but also on par 3 holes that the bogey cannot reach in one shot, if the roll is determined to be at least 5 yards higher or lower than the 20-yard average. So what we do is we look at roll based on the fairway slope or tilt and the firmness of the fairway. So there's a table for roll that I'm going to show here in a second, but it's used only on the tee shot. The tee shot is where the majority of the roll is going to be gained or lost on a hole. On second or third shots, if the player can't reach the green, those sometimes are more positioning as opposed to necessarily maxing out the distance. So it's typically on the tee shot where the player has a driver in their hand where the roll makes the biggest impact. So like I said, each point of roll may change the approach shot by about 5 yards. It's not exact. Maybe it's 10 yards, etc. It really depends on the the severity of the slope or the mounds, etc. that might increase or decrease roll. So you want to adjust your landing zones accordingly. So here's a hole that's basically uphill. The landing zone is slightly uphill from the tee all the way to the green. So the player is going to normally land up here. But because they're losing some roll, now their landing zone's a little bit farther back. So maybe in this case, they've lost 10 yards of roll. So they normally get 20, but in this case, they're only getting 10. We would basically go into our table and say, if you look at the table on the top of the screen to the right, it says uphill amount of rolls, amount of yards lost. If we say they lost somewhere in the 10 to 14 range, we're going to put a 2 in there, or a +2. Pluses and minuses are in the book, but you don't have to necessarily put a plus if as long as it's not a minus, it doesn't matter. But it could be a 2 or a +2, it's the same value. But again, we're going to adjust that approach shot. So in this case, because the player lost 10 yards of roll, they're coming in from a longer distance to the green. So instead of coming in from 140, now they're coming in from 150. So basically, each point of roll is essentially 5 yards. So if it's 2 points a roll, we're looking at 10. If it's 3 points, we're looking at 15. The maximum roll from the table is ±4, which would essentially be 20 yards, where they're losing all of it or gaining an additional 20. But there are adjustments as well that can increase or decrease that even further. So our adjustments for roll, one is the firm adjustment, which is really F, which represents firm or soft. So the F is F in soft and the F in firm. But as you can see here, one is a +1 and one is a -1. The +1 means that the fairways are soft, where the ball is going to get less than, lose at least 5 yards of roll on the tee shot. So maybe the hole is as flat as a board where there's no slope uphill or downhill, but the fairways are soft. We can still give it the +1 adjustment for the soft conditions. The opposite of that would be the firm conditions, where the ball rolls at least an additional 5 yards because of the firmness of the fairway. So whether it's 5 yards, whether it's 10 yards, or even more than that, you're maxed out as a -1 adjustment in that case. But this is, again, on top of the table value. So you might have a downhill and firm fairway where you're getting a -3 off the table and an additional -1 for being firm, and maybe get a -4 overall. So these adjustments are basically applied on top of the table value. Now, this adjustment can only be applied on a second shot or a third shot, not on a tee shot. But this basically says if a subsequent full shot results in 15 or less yards of roll. Essentially, if that player is losing more than five or more yards of roll on a second or a third shot, a full shot, not a shot to the green, but a shot to another landing zone, you can apply an additional point of roll using the 2 adjustment. The opposite of that is if the player is getting 25 yards or more of roll, then you can take a point away from the roll. Again, a minus actually means the hole's playing shorter. A plus means it's playing longer. So here's an example of that, where we have a hole that's downhill from tee to green. It drops about 100 feet from the tee all the way to the green. So this player has 2 landing zones where they're likely going to get additional roll. So you're going to have a table value based on the tee shot landing zone. And that second landing zone, you're going to have a -1 adjustment for the 2 adjustment. The 2 really represents you have roll in a second or additional landing zone. All right, elevation. Our next category is elevation. Pretty simple in terms of the concept. All we're looking at is the difference in elevation change between the tee and the green. We're not concerned with what's happening between the tee and the green. So if you have a hole that the tee and the green are pretty much level, but there's a big drop off, down a slope and then back up to the green, that's going to be rated under different categories, such as topography or roll, approach shot, things like that. So basically, this is only determining the difference between the tee itself and the green and what that elevation change is. We only have to worry about this if it gets to be at least 10 feet or more. If it's less than 10 feet, we just record. Most holes are going to have at least a couple feet of elevation change. It's pretty rare for them to be exactly level, but until it gets to 10 feet or more, we don't have to worry about writing down a value. So as you can see in the imagery to the right, some people use GPS, some people use altimeters, them get elevation changes. Really, we're just looking for your best estimate, whether it's using some sort of device or using your vision, your common sense, tree heights, things like that you can determine it. But you want to get within the nearest 10-foot increment. We don't have to be so precise that we're putting in 12 feet or 17 feet. It's going to be either 10 feet or 20 feet using standard rounding. So once that gets to a +15 or a -15, those would both round to a 20-foot change in elevation. So just round to the nearest 10-foot increment. So as it says here, uphill 25 feet would be recorded as +30, and 14 feet downhill would be recorded as -10. So 5s round up and 4s round down, like standard rounding. Now on a par 4 or par 5, there is no maximum elevation change. If you have 100 feet or 200 feet, you can record it. But for a par 3 hole, we do have a maximum elevation of 40 feet up or down. So really, once you get above there, the hole doesn't, especially downhill, the hole really doesn't play any shorter. Once a hole's dropping more than 40 feet, the ball at that point is pretty much going on a straight, downhill vertical, trajectory. So it really doesn't make the hole a whole lot shorter by being 50 or 60 or 70 feet downhill than 40. And then uphill, we rarely see par 3 holes that are more than 40 feet uphill. So here's a hole that's obviously downhill. We're at the tee box. We're looking at the green, determine what that elevation change is between the tee and the green. In this case, we're going to say it's minus 30. This is one value you do not have to record separately for scratch and bogey, because if we're rating the white tees, it's going to be the same 30-foot downhill shot for the scratch or the bogey. However, each tee may have a different elevation. So your gold tee or your red tee might be less because the gold tee in front of it or the red tee in front of it might only be down 20 feet instead of down 30 feet. So each tee is going to have the same elevation for scratch and bogey, but each individual tee could have a different elevation compared to other tees. Okay, dogleg force layup is our third category for effective playing length. And really, this is a measure of how much longer or shorter a hole plays because it either has a dog leg, a bend, that allows the player to either cut the corner or has to lay up because of that, or because it has obstacles such as penalty areas or bunkers that cross the fairway in the player's landing zone and require a force layup. So this is a dogleg hole from overhead. You can see that in this case, the pivot point of the dogleg is about 220 yards for the men or equivalent of 180 for the women to get to that pivot point. And then from that pivot point to the green is another 180 yards. So this hole was measured. It actually be measured at 400 yards for men and 360 for women. That's how the hole's been measured. However, in this case, the player cannot get the full 250 yards for men or 210 yards for women off the tee on a direct line towards the green. Once a hole pivots, the player is no longer gaining distance directly towards the green. So we would need to add the appropriate yardage for, in this case, the scratch golfer, because going beyond that pivot point in a straight line doesn't really get them any closer to the green. In fact, if it's a 90-degree pivot, it actually would be farther from the green the farther you go past the pivot. So in this case, it winds up being about the same. So we're going to go ahead and put an adjustment in here that's equal to how much longer is the approach shot compared to what it should have been if this hole was straight. So if this hole was straight, the player would have had a 150-yard approach shot. But because of the dog leg, they really can't get much closer than 180. We're going to put in a plus 30 dog leg for scratch. So 30 additional yards of scratch effective length. Bogey's going to have, a different value, maybe no value, depending on where their landing zone is. But you would have to rate this separately for scratch and bogey because those pivot points and where those landing zones are going to be are different places. Now, the opposite of that is where you have a dog leg where the player can cut the corner. So maybe the hole was measured along this red line of play to the middle of the fairway and then to the green, but the player from a certain tee has the ability to cut over the corner a little bit, save a little bit of yardage. Instead of coming in from, let's say, 150, they're coming in from 130, and now they have a minus 20 dogleg adjustment. So those raters in the room, they're experienced. You guys are probably pretty familiar with how to make these adjustments. But for the newer raters that are in the room, this is something you probably will have to just shadow or listen to the experienced people about how to handle dog legs and when to make those adjustments. The one thing about a dogleg adjustment is we have a minimum dogleg adjustment of 10 yards. If it's less than 10 yards, we're not going to make an adjustment. It's just too close to zero to really make that kind of adjustment. Now, the more common adjustment for a layup would be a force layup, where the player has something in front of them that they cannot safely carry, and it causes them to hit less than a full shot. So as you can see here, when a severe obstacle or combination of obstacles, such as penalty areas, deep bunkers, etc., crosses the fairway, or the distance between those severe obstacles is less than 15 yards. So if you have two really deep bunkers out in the fairway landing zone, it's only 12 yards between them, even though the player could theoretically hit a shot between them, that's just too tight to call that a reasonable shot. So we're going to call that a forced layup. So as a result, the player will hit less than a full shot. In this category, the largest value you can record on a given hole is plus or minus 50 yards. So even if the layup is 60 yards, the most you can put on the form is plus 50. So here's an example where we have a creek that crosses the middle of the hole in the fairway, and the player cannot safely carry it. And so if they hit their full shot, they're going to wind up in that creek, in that penalty area. So we're going to want to lay them up a minimum of 10 yards short of that trouble or of the penalty area. So we don't want them laying up 1 yard or 5 yards short of it. That's just too risky. So a minimum of 10 yards short. It could be more, especially if it's a downslope or there's potential that the player could still get into that trouble, that penalty area within a 10-yard window. We might want to go back to 15 or maybe even 20. Wind, this is a category where you really shouldn't have to worry about as a course rater. The team leader's probably making a decision, or the CDGA, whether it's John or Cullen, somebody making a decision on what wind to use. This is based on average daily wind speeds at time when golf is played. We try to get some information from weather services, websites, etc., that gives us some indication of what a wind speed would be. But essentially, we're just putting in an overall adjustment for yardage based on wind. So there's a table here that says, if your wind speed is, 11 to 12 miles an hour, we're going to add 54 yards of effective length per 9. If it gets greater than that, you can see it goes up. So it maxes out at greater than 20, which we don't have too many courses in the country that have a greater than 20 average wind speed, other than some coastal courses and some really, maybe island areas where they have some pretty severe winds. But in general, your wind speeds are going to be, somewhere between 5 and maybe 12 to 15 at the most. So, but again, you defer this to the team leader or the CDGA staff on terms of what to use for the wind. And the last effective playing length category we'll cover very quickly because you won't have to deal with this, but this is only at courses 2,000 feet or more above sea level. We make corrections to the shot lengths, but also we make it a correction to the overall playing length of the golf course. So we have a table that basically says how much farther a ball will go at altitude. Again, this doesn't start till at least 2,000 feet, which you don't have a single course in Illinois that's even close to 2,000 feet. So you don't have to worry about this. All right, any questions on any of the effective playing length factors?
Nope, no questions.
Okay. Hopefully I'm not going too fast, just trying to keep it moving here. So now we're going to go through each of the obstacles. So these obstacles, I'm not going to cover everything. I'm not going to cover every adjustment, every nuance that you might run across, just kind of giving a basic overview of each obstacle and some common adjustments. So the first one we evaluate is topography. And topography is essentially the impact of terrain on play, how much stance and lie might be affected by, the topography, but also uphill or downhill approach shots. So as you can see, slopes and mounds in the landing zones affect the stance or lie, or the shot to the green is uphill or downhill. So as you can see in the table, the higher or the more uphill or downhill the shot is to the green, the higher that table value is going to be. So if you have a 20-foot uphill shot to the green from the landing zone, you're going to use the plus 20 uphill row of the table. And then over on the right-hand side of the table are all your stance or lie categories. So you have a par 3 hole has its own category. A par 3 hole is the only hole where you can get a 0 because it's the only time when you're able to tee the ball up and not have to worry about the lie. Once the player is hitting the ball off of the fairway, off of the turf, we're going to give it a minimum rating of 1. Because no matter how good that turf is maintained, there's going to be some potential issues with the lie of the ball or maybe a stance issue. So even a minor problem is still going to get a minimum rating of 1. But as you can see, there's 5 different categories: minor, minor to moderate, moderate, significant, and extreme. We rarely see extreme. We pretty rarely see significant. So the majority of the time, you're going to be in those first 4 categories, which would be either the par 3 hole or minor, minor to moderate, or moderate. Those are probably what you're going to wind up using 95% of the time or more. So how do we define those? So a minor problem is where the player doesn't have a whole lot of issues with stance or lie. As you can see here, the fairway is pretty flat. There might be a couple little small depressions. There might be a slight slide hill lie here and there, but nothing that the player is going to really have to change the stance or really worry too much about. So that would be a minor issue. Once you get to the minor to moderate, now we have some areas of the fairway that might have some issues with stance or lie. So maybe the majority of the fairway is pretty flat, but there's some areas where there's some downslopes or some side hills where the player might have to deal with, some awkward stance or awkward lie. Then you could give it something between minor and moderate. So again, we're looking at the overall average of the fairway landing zone, not just the worst part of it. Now here's more of a moderate where the player has really no level stance or lie, but it's not too severe. Maybe it's just a general upslope, a general side slope, but they're never going to have a real flat lie, but it's not going to be terrible either. Significant is where you might have the ball well above your feet, well below your feet, maybe some of these, kind of mounding within the fairway where the player is really going to have some tough stances and lie, maybe get to a significant. I don't even have an example photo of extreme because it's really just hard to find that. So here's just a quick rating example for topography. If we had a hole where we're going to say that the fairway landing zone had moderate stance and lie problems, and it was an uphill 20-foot approach shot, so the ball, the player has to hit the ball up 20 feet to get to the green. We're going to use the +20 row of the table and then move over to the moderately awkward column, and that's going to give us a table value of 5. So it's a pretty simple table to use because you're just looking at 2 different values. There are no adjustments for topography. You don't have to worry about any additional adjustments. It's just the table value. The only thing that might be a little tricky is when you have multiple landing zones. So maybe on a long par 4 or for a bogey or a par 5 hole where you have 2 landing zones, you have to evaluate each landing zone separately. But again, only the approach shot to the green uses those approach shot elevation changes. So if the landing zone 1 to landing zone 2 goes up 10 feet or 20 feet, it doesn't matter. We're still going to use that very top row of the table, which is a shot from the landing zone to landing zone. And if you have multiple landing zones, you're going to give the highest rating you get. So if your tee shot landing zone to landing zone is a 2 and your approach shot is a 5, the final value is a 5. So if you have multiple landing zones, multiple evaluation, highest value that you get from that. Questions on topography?
No questions in the chat. And I don't see
Hopefully.
any in the room.
One of the easier obstacles to rate. So, all right, our next category is fairway. What we're looking at is keeping the ball, the evaluation of keeping the ball in the fairway from tee to green. So we're looking at the width of that fairway and all landing zones, the length of the hole, and any nearby trees, severe obstacles, or punitive rough that might make that fairway play narrower than it actually is. So as you can see here, the fairway width is something we're going to have to measure. So you want to measure the average fairway width in the landing zone. It's not just a single point, but it's that average of that entire landing zone. So if the fairway is contour cut where it gets narrower or wider in certain places, you don't want to use the narrowest or use the widest, use an average of those. The second thing is in this image, you can see that it has an intermediate cut. We treat the half fairway, half rough. So if you have a 2-yard wide intermediate cut on both sides of the fairway, you're going to use 1 yard of each side. So half of the distance of each side. So essentially, if there's 4 yards of total intermediate cut, 2 yards on each side, you're going to add 2 yards to your fairway width. So you're going to measure that and record that. Again, average of the width of the landing zone. And then our table here, we look at the width of the fairway landing zone as it says across the middle of that table, across the columns. And then the left and right columns are based on the length of the hole. So as you can see, there's going to be different values for men and women. So if you're rating for men, you might get a different rating for fairway than you would for women, even from the same hole, same length hole, because women, the hole lengths are a little bit shorter in general. So as it notes at the bottom, if the fairway is less than 20 yards wide, a W plus adjustment cannot be applied, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But in general, your table value just gets higher as your hole gets longer or the fairway gets narrower. A long hole with a narrow fairway is about as hard as it gets for fairway. A short hole with a wide fairway is pretty easy. So that's why the numbers kind of go up progressively like that. So the width adjustment is probably the most common adjustment to use for fairway. Essentially, this is an adjustment that allows you to adjust for the effective width of the fairway by saying, you know what, the fairway measures at 30 yards wide, but because of something, it's not going to play that wide. So in this case, you can adjust it based on a dog leg, overhanging tree branches, contour or tilt, so that the shot must be played to one side, or severe obstacles on one side where the player is going to do their best to avoid it. They're going to make that fairway a little bit narrower. So we can apply a +1 or +2 adjustment depending on the severity of those issues. And again, do not use if the fairway is less than 20 yards, because once you're less than 20 yards, you're giving it the max fairway value. Whether it's 1 yard wide or 20 yards wide, it gets the same, or 19 yards wide, it gets the same table value. So we don't want to add additional points to that because, again, it's you're kind of going above and beyond the minimum possible fairway width. But the width adjustment can also be a negative number. There are times when there's something that actually increases the effective fairway width. So as you can see here on the left side of the hole, that sloped area, if the ball hits up in that area and tends to bounce down into the fairway, we can actually increase the effective width of the fairway by applying a -1 adjustment to the table value. So if the table value is a 4, but you have this entire side of the fairway where the ball hits and rolls back in the fairway, we're going to reduce that from a 4 down to a 3. Not super common, but a lot of course architects will sometimes build holes where they help you, or sometimes they'll hurt you. But when they help you, you definitely don't want to ignore that. So we're going to do a quick fairway rating based on a pretty standard hole here. We have a par 4 hole that is unreachable for the bogey in 2 shots, but for the scratch is reachable. So it's 430 yards for the men, or in the brackets there, 370 if you were rating for women. So our bogey's first landing zone is 42 yards wide. So on our rating form, we're going to record that under the bogey first landing zone width. Going back, a number of slides where we talk about scratch and bogey, we write the scratch numbers on the left side of the form, the bogey numbers on the right. So as we're in a bogey landing zone, we're going to write that on the right side of this form. Then we're going to go up to our scratch landing zone, which is farther up the hole, obviously, and the fairway width's only 34 yards wide. So for our scratch landing zone width, we're going to record 34. And then the bogey golfer, because they can't reach this green in 2, has an additional landing zone where it's only 26 yards wide. So the bogey has a second landing zone width that's 26. But when we go to our fairway table, it's going to give us, well, I don't have it up on the screen, but if you had your book, using that length hole and using those fairway widths, you're going to get a 4 for the scratch, 34-yard wide fairway at a 430-yard hole for men, or 370 for women's at 4. For the bogey, you're going to take the higher of the 2 values. Now, without any adjustments in play, the narrower fairway is always going to give you at least the same, but usually a higher fairway value. So there's really no reason to look up the 42-yard wide fairway, because the 26-yard fairway is going to give you the higher number, and that's going to wind up being a 5. So this is pretty much the table value of fairway. You're going to apply the width of the fairway to the length of the hole and come up with a table value. And then again, any adjustments on top of that would be applied. But in this case, we don't have those. Questions on fairway?
No questions in the chat. And
All right.
no questions in the room.
Good. We might have some in the next couple categories because they're a little bit more complex. So our next category, I would say, is the most important category in the system, which is green target. The reason I say that is that the value you determine for green target will actually help you determine the next 2 obstacle categories, which is recoverability in rough and bunkers. So the size of the green actually influences 2 other categories. So you want to make sure that this obstacle rating is done as accurate as possible, which is, should be done anyways. So what we're doing with green target is evaluating hitting the green with the approach shot. How difficult is it for the player to hit the green with their approach shot, which is based on the size of the green and the approach shot length. Those are the 2 main categories, or 2 main considerations for what is your green target value. How long of a shot? How big is the green? Also, we look at things such as, can you see the green? Is the green surface not visible for at least half of it? Is the green firm? Things that would make the green either tougher or in some cases easier to hit. If the green's soft, it could be easier. So here is our table value for green target. We have a separate table again for men and women. So the women are going to be using the table on the left, which is in gold, and then the men are the table in the blue and the right. Because again, they're going to have different shot lengths into the green. They're going to have different, impact of how difficult the shot is based on the length of the shot. So, but as you can see, there are 6 different categories of effective green diameter, which are those middle columns in the table. That's essentially how big is the green if it were a circle. And I'm going to go over that here in a minute. But on the left and the right side of each table, you have the shot length. So the scratch golfer comes in from the left side with their shot length. The bogey golfer comes in from the right side with their shot length. And that then you move it to the middle column based on the size of the green, and that gives you your green target. I'm going to do an example here towards the end of this section. But how do we determine effective green diameter? Essentially, on average, we're looking at the average width and depth of the green. So in this case, we have a green that's 32 yards wide and 26 yards deep. We're going to go ahead and average those 2 values, which is going to give us 29. So this is essentially how big the green would be if it were a circle. So we're essentially condensing every green into what size it would be if it were a circle, which is where the effective green diameter comes into play. Now, not all greens are circular in shape. You might have greens that are more oval, extended oval, let's say, where one dimension is more than 2 times, but less than 3 times the other dimension. If this is the case, you can no longer use just the average of the width and the depth. You're going to use a weighted average. So you're going to use 2 of the shorter distance, in this case 14, used twice, 1 of the longer distance, which is 30, and then divide that all by 3. So you're using a weighted average using 2 of the short, 1 of the long, and the overall weighted average comes out as 19. These greens don't fit the player's shot well. Players' shot patterns are fairly circular, where their distance front, left to right and front to back is pretty consistent. When you get a green that has most of the premium on one direction or the other, it's going to play a little bit harder. The player doesn't have nearly the room for error going front and back, or long and short in this case. Now, this is pretty uncommon. You don't find a lot of these, but if you have a green that happens to be more than 3 times one dimension versus the other, we were going to use the same concept. We're going to use 3 of the shorter distance, 1 of the longer distance, and then divide it all by 4 to get a weighted average, in this case of 19 as well. So again, this green has a lot of room for error front to back, 40 yards, but left to right, it's only 12 yards wide. This green plays a lot smaller than if you just average the 40 and the 12 together. So one of the common adjustments you'll have is visibility. Usually you have to have courses with a decent amount of elevation changes to have this, but if you have greens that sit well above the fairway and you can't see at least half the green surface on the approach shot, we're going to give it an additional point for visibility. Again, the player may know what's up there. They may know a little bit about how big the green is, but not being able to see the green, or at least half the green, always gives a little bit more uncertainty than if the player can see the green. If the green is completely blind, which means they can't even see the top of the flagstick, so they don't even know necessarily the direction, or the exact direction to get to the green, we're going to add 2 points to the green target table. So +1s are far more common than +2s. You won't see many +2s, especially in Illinois, where you don't have significant elevation changes, maybe outside of some courses out west, or maybe down in southern Illinois if you have some. So here's an example of, we're going to do a green target rating. This happens to be a pretty well-known hole, the 17th hole at TPC Sawgrass. This hole is only 137 yards long. So we have a 137-yard approach shot for both scratch and bogey. They both can reach this green in one shot. We're going to go ahead, just for simplicity, and keep this as just a men's rating, so we don't have to do it twice. So for men, if we're looking at the green target table, our effective diameter, as you can see across the top there, which I can't see because of the menu items, I think it's 23 or 22. It's going to be a 4 for scratch. So you're going to go to the table where 137-yard approach shot to the column between 22 and 26 is going to be a 4. And for the bogey, coming in from the right side of the table, that value is going to be a 5. So it's the same length shot for scratch and bogey, but the bogey golfer gets a higher rating because it's obviously a tougher shot for bogey than scratch. So this is where we add a little bit of complexity. Because we have holes that are right at the limit of where a player can reach, we need to determine what to do about those holes. What happens if a hole is just beyond where they normally can reach in 2 or 3? What do we do with those holes? So when we have a hole that's in that category, we're going to use what we call transition, which is essentially, we're not going to rate it as if they get there every time. We're not going to rate it as if they never get there. We're going to kind of rate it as if they sometimes get there and they sometimes don't. So when you have that really long shot to the green, you're going to get a really high green target off the table. When you have a really short shot to the green, you're going to have a really low number. We don't want to use either one. We want to use a number that's somewhat in between. So when the hole falls in those 2 extremes, where it's kind of, sometimes reachable, sometimes not, we're going to use an intermediate value and call that a transition zone concept. So the transition zone, there's a table for this actually on the right side of the page, but it's at the beginning of the course rating guide. Essentially, it's a 10-yard additional window on a single shot. On a tee shot, the player can get an additional 10 yards of distance to be able to reach some holes that are just longer than the normal average distance. And then once a player is hitting 2 or more shots, we add another 10 yards. So it's basically a total of 20 yards of additional distance for 2, 3, or 4 shot holes. We don't add 10 yards per shot. So it's not like a 3-shot hole has 30 yards and a 4-shot hole has 40 yards. It's just a flat 20 yards of additional potential distance once the player gets to a 2 or more shot hole. What that means is if a hole falls into those ranges, all those ranges on the right, in the table on the right, for second shot, third shot, etc., that's a hole that starts in transition. The player might be able to get there, but might not be able to get there. We're going to rate that a little different. So the concept is, if the player is expected to reach the green at least 50% of the time, we're going to use only the long shot for the evaluation of the obstacles near the green, which means we're not going to have to determine a second landing zone or another landing zone. We're just going to assume that the player can get to the green in that second shot or the third shot, depending on which transition it is. However, we're still going to use the transition zone value for green target. And that's going to bleed into R&R and bunkers. So we no longer need to find a landing zone just short of the green to further evaluate obstacles. However, if it's determined that the player is expected to reach the green less than 50% of the time, we do need to find another landing zone just short of the green. We say 10 yards short is a good spot, and evaluate that additional landing zone for fairway, for bunkers, for lateral obstacles, etc. Essentially, what we're saying is that players more than likely not reaching the green is going to have an additional shot on that hole, and we need to evaluate how difficult that additional landing zone would be. Either way, you're actually going to still use the transition zone green target value. The only difference in this case is you have an additional landing zone to evaluate for when the player doesn't get there at least 50% of the time. But if they get there 50% or more of the time, you don't have an additional landing zone. So, but the green target value is going to be the same either way. So that very bottom row of the green target table represents the transition zone value, which is essentially average of the long and the short shot values in each column. So if the player doesn't get to the green, they're going to be using that top column, or sorry, the top row of the table, which is pretty much twos. And then if they do get there, if they happen to get there, they're going to be using that number at the bottom of the table, which is somewhere between 5 and 10. So that number at the very, very bottom transition is just an average of those two. So here's an example of a hole that's in transition. This happens to be for the bogey golfer. A hole that's 380 yards for men or 290 for women is technically in transition. The normal two-shot distance for the bogey golfer for men is 370, for women's 280. So this hole's 10 yards longer than what we would say they can reach every single time, but it's within the 20-yard window that they could potentially reach. So that, like I said, transition is a 20-yard deep zone for a 2 or more shot hole. So the bogey golfer has a chance to get to this green in 2 shots, but they're not going to be able to do it every single time. So this hole happens to fall smack dab in the middle of that 20-yard transition zone. So the transition zone runs from 370 for men to 390, and for women from 280 to 300. So this hole is right in the middle of that zone. So it would be a good idea just to say they're going to get there 50% of the time. So you would apply that 50% or more concept. So this is kind of an overhead where this is their landing zone, and they have a really long shot to get to the green, but they can do it. If they can't get there, you're going to have an additional landing zone. But if they get there, you're going to treat it almost as if it's a reachable par 4. You're going to give them, the green target based on transition, but you're going to evaluate your bunkers and your stuff around the green just as if they got there in 2 shots. If they don't get there in 2 shots, or it's determined less than 50% of the time, we need to evaluate that little landing zone just short of the green, which might have a narrow fairway, a squeeze bunker, things like that can change the rating a little bit. All right, questions. I know the transition zone for the new people in the room is probably pretty complex, but it's something you just kind of pick up as you do more and more ratings.
All right, I don't have any questions online. Cullen?
Yeah, we've got one in person here.
Is
Sure.
it 50% to the center of the green or to the green?
To the center. Yeah, so when we say reach the green, we mean reach the center. So if you have a green that's very deep, let's say the green is 40 yards deep, and the player's mathematical 2-shot distance gets them on the front of the green, maybe they wind up 5 or 10 yards on the front edge of the green, that technically is not reaching the green. Our hole measurements are to the middle of the green. So for us to say a player reaches the green, they have to cover the full distance to the middle of the green. If that makes sense. Okay. No more questions?
Nope.
Okay.
All good.
So our next category is recoverability in rough, which we don't like to say, so we just shorten it to R&R, which is a lot easier. So our R&R ratings are essentially the probability of missing the tee shot landing zone and the green, and the difficulty of recovering if either or both is missed. So our table value for R&R is based on the green target. Like I mentioned earlier, you need to know your green target before you can do your R&R value, because that's part of it. Also, what type of grass it is, cool or warm, and the height of that grass. So as you can see, you need to know the green target before you can even go to the R&R table, because it's part of the table itself. So as you can see, here's the table. Your left and right hand columns of the table are based on your scratch target. So if your scratch green target was let's say a 4, you're going to use the 4 row on the left. If your bogey green target was a 6, you're going to use the 6 row on the right, and you're going to kind of move those to the column that represents the rough height. So the women again are on the bottom of the table, the men are on the top. So most rough is going to be similar for men and women. You know, if you have 2-inch rough, it's going to be the same whether you're rating for men or women. If you have less than 2, it's going to be the same. Once you get to 2 or greater, you could have some differences. So if your rough is right at 3 inches, it's going to be maybe one category for men, but maybe a different category for women. But in general, they tend to be about the same. And again, this is the average rough height. This is not the minimum. This is not the maximum. So you really do want to talk to the club about what they like to maintain the rough height at, but also do your own kind of evaluation. What they tell you that their setting is on the mower doesn't necessarily mean that's what the rough height is. If they say, oh, we cut it at 2.5 inches on the mower, that might actually cut it at 2. It might actually cut it at 3. It's not exact. So just kind of get a nice average rough height based on all the information you have available. So R&R has the most adjustments of any obstacle or any category because missing greens and missing fairways has a lot of issues that can pop up. So this is a very common one. Mounds, a lot of holes, a lot of greens have mounds surrounding it. A lot of fairways have mounds surrounding it. So we say if grass mounds or hollows are present near the fairway landing zone, consider their severity, number, and location. You can apply a +1. And at the green, if a significant portion of the green is closely bordered by mounds or hollows and or rise and drop of greater than 5 feet, you can also apply a +1. These are shot-specific adjustments. So any adjustment that has an asterisk next to it, so the M has a little asterisk right next to it, that means it's shot-specific. It means it can be applied multiple times. So if you have mounds in the fairway, it could be a +1. If you have mounds again at the green, it could be another +1 for a total of +2. So they're kind of cumulative. There are some adjustments that aren't shot specific where you just apply once the entire hole, but these are shot specific. And as you can see, you can even put a +2 in for a mounds adjustment if severe grass mounds or hollows are around the green or a rise and drop of greater than 10 feet. So it doesn't necessarily have to be mounds where they kind of go up and down. It could just be a green that sits well above the surrounding area where the green is 9, 10, 12 feet above the surrounding area. It's just a kind of a push-up green, if you want to call it that. That can get this adjustment as well. It's not just about the mounds, but about a rise and drop around the green as well. So another adjustment you might have is an inconsistent adjustment where the rough is not consistent throughout the hole. So maybe in the fairway, the rough is the normal 2 to 3 inch fairway rough, but when you get near the green, it drops down to fairway height, or maybe it gets to less than 1 inch. You can apply either a plus or minus adjustment if the rough near the landing zone or closely bordering the green is much more severe or much less severe than the rough height of the hole in general. So, we're seeing more and more courses that are changing rough height throughout the hole, where if you miss a fairway, you're in standard rough, 2 to 3 inch rough, but around the green, they mow it all down. So there's not a single blade of rough around the green, maybe for a 5 or 10 yard window. If the player can putt from it, if they can do easy bump and run shots, you can actually reduce the rating because it's a little easier than being in traditional rough where they only have maybe one option to play the shot. We can also use the inconsistent adjustment as a +1 when a significant portion of the green is closely bordered by sloping ground, cut to fairway height that results in shots just missing the green, ending up much farther from the green. This is where, yes, they have the rough cut down around the green, but it's not making it easier. It's actually making it more difficult. In this case, you miss the green by a foot or two and you wind up 15 yards away from the green because it rolls down the hill farther and farther away. So Pinehurst or some of these courses that have these features where, they're shaved around the greens, they have, no real rough around the greens, but they're sloped enough where the ball runs away and makes those recovery shots much more difficult. So the inconsistent can actually be a plus or a minus depending on whether it makes it easier or harder than normal. And also, like I mentioned in the changes, we rolled in the unpleasant adjustment into here, where if you have extensive areas of hard pan, you can apply a +1 as well. These would have to be consistently that way throughout the season and throughout multiple seasons. It can't just be that they've had no rain for 3 weeks and they're hard pan. These would have to be, this course always has hard pan. There's always issues with growing grass in these particular areas. So it's got to be more of a permanent thing than a temporary thing. Another adjustment that's not common, but you'll run across here and there is a surrounded adjustment. This is actually rated under the lateral obstacles category, but if you've rated it as a +2 adjustment under lateral obstacles, R&R a +1 adjustment for surround as well. All this means is that if the player misses the green and winds up staying out of the water, their next shot is still going to be more difficult because they have water around enough of the green that their pitch and chip shots become just that more, treacherous. Nobody wants to be in that bunker to the left or be in the rough to the left of the green, playing to a whole location on the, far right. If they go a little long, they're back in the water that they just, carried on the tee shot. So anytime there's water surrounding the green, it can make recovery shots more difficult as well. And then another one that you'll run across, which is typically from more of your longer tees, which is where the bogey golfer has a really hard time just getting to the fairway. So there's a table here that says how long is the shot to get to the fairway and how long is the rough between the tee and the fairway. And that's going to give you additional points of adjustment as well. So you can get as much as a +4 adjustment if it's a very long shot to reach the fairway and the rough is pretty severe. But if it's a shorter shot and the rough's not bad, it may get a 0, may get, maybe a +1. But this again typically happens from some of your longer tees we probably wouldn't play from, but we still have to rate it. And then one last adjustment here, par 3 adjustment. This would be an adjustment that applies when a bogey golfer cannot reach a par 3 hole in one shot. So anytime you have a par 3 for men like 200 plus, or for women 150, 160 plus, they're likely not getting to the green in one shot unless it's downhill or some sort of roll issue. They're going to have an adjustment that says if the bogey golfer cannot reach the green, and again this is going to be the center of the green, in one shot and the area short of the green is at least 20 yards wide, we're still going to give it a +1 adjustment. If that area short of the green is less than 20 yards wide or no fairway exists at all, we're going to give it a +2. The whole rationale behind this one is that we do not have fairway ratings for par 3 holes. So if the bogey golfer can't reach a par 3 hole in one shot, we have no way of giving them a fairway value for what they might encounter in the fairway short of the green. So we're going to give them additional points under R&R for the fact that we can't give them a number for fairway. They're essentially getting a 0. So this just kind of allows us to add a couple points, 1 or 2 points to unreachable par 3s. So I'm going to do a quick example of an R&R rating here. We have a hole that we've already determined has a green target of 5 for scratch and 6 for bogey. We're going to go into our R&R table there on the right, and we're going to say our rough height is 2 1/4 inch cool season rough. So that's going to be in the 2 to 3 inch category for the men and the 2 to 2.5 category for the women, which is the very middle row of that table to the right. So we're going to go into the table, and then also around the green, we have a rise and drop covering more than half the green of 7 feet. So we're going to do these in order. So our table value, first and foremost, is going to be, again, 2 1/4 inch rough for men or women. Scratch green target was a 5. So we're going to go to the middle column of that table, middle row. It's going to be a 5. For the bogey, we're coming in from the right-hand side under the 6 or 7 row. And we're going to move again to the middle column of the table. And that's going to be a 6. So our table value for R&R in this case is 5 for scratch and 6 for bogey. Then we're going to look at the adjustments. And as mentioned on the left side, there is more than half the green with a rise and drop of 7 feet. If a significant portion of the green is surrounded by a rise and drop of at least 5 feet, we have the ability to add a +1 mounds adjustment, which we would here. So we're going to add that additional point and get a final rating of 6 for scratch and 7 for bogey. So we've added an additional point to the table value to get that final number. As you can see in the box, there's a small M written there. We do like to have those adjustment codes written on the form when they're used so that somebody can see why that number is what it is. So these forms are eventually shared with either the team leader or the staff at the CDGA, or somebody's going to see these forms. And if they see these numbers and these letters, they're going to understand how that number was derived. So it is important to write those adjustment codes down so that you kind of have a full picture of how you got that number. All right, questions on recoverability and rough?
No questions online.
All right, good. Moving right along.
Yes, we do have
Oh,
a
you got
question
one?
out in the
Sorry.
audience here. 1 second.
Go ahead.
So my question is, first cut of rough, does that ever affect the rating? So those courses that have, I don't know, 2 or 3 yards of a first cut of rough, does that affect ratings at all?
So they have like graduated rough, like where it's not the same all the way through the entire area, or are you talking about an intermediate cut?
Talk about the transition from the fairway to the rough. So
Yeah,
you,
so yeah, I mean, an intermediate cut, like I said, we rate as half fairway, half rough, but we really don't change the R&R rating based on the fact that there's an intermediate cut. Now, if there's an extended intermediate cut, let's say there's a 10-yard wide swath of rough that's cut at like 1 inch, and then it goes to 2 to 3 inches after that, that would be a case where you might want to use an average and say, well, if you miss the fairway by up to 10 yards, you're only in 1 inch rough, but once you get beyond 10 yards, you're in 2 to 3. Maybe you use an overall average of 2, something like that. So, but it would really depend on how wide that intermediate cut would be.
thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, how do you measure the distance, that you're below the green or above the green? I mean, you can do it with a slope meter, but you're so close there. How do you measure the distance?
Just use yourself. I mean, if you're standing down at the bottom of the hill and you're 6 feet or 5.5, whatever you are tall, just is the level of the green above you. That's 5 feet. 10 feet is just kind of the height of a basketball rim. I mean, it's just a judgment call, but yeah, you're probably not going to get a true, measurement of height differences between the areas just close to the green, because, altimeters and stuff probably don't work that closely, but
So it's an average. For
All right, thanks. Anybody else? All good?
all right, cool. All right, moving right along here. Our next category is bunkers. Bunker ratings are based on, again, the green target. We need to know before we can determine our bunker rating. How much of the green is surrounded by bunkers? We use fractions in quarters, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And then the difficulty of recovering from those bunkers. Obviously, bunkers have a variety of recovery problems, whether they're deep, whether they have, extreme features, et cetera. So we have to rate those as well. So this is our greenside bunker table. This is applied only based on the bunkers around the green. And as you can see here, we have 4 categories of green closely bordered by bunkers, which is greater than 0 to 1/4, greater than 1/4 to 1/2, greater than 1/2 to 3/4, then greater than 3/4. So you basically have 4 categories to choose from. If it's 0, if there's not a single bunker around the green, you don't use this table. This table is specifically for greenside bunkers. So there has to be at least one bunker that qualifies as a greenside before you can even use this table. But as you can see in the table, the left-hand side is the scratch green target rating. The right-hand side is the bogey. Again, you find their green target, you find the fraction of the green closely bordered, and you get that table value. So how do we determine the fraction of the green surrounded by bunkers? We first need to define what a greenside bunker is. And we're going to say anything within 10 yards of the edge of the green qualifies as a greenside bunker. That's considered closely bordering. Now, that is generally, we can include bunkers that are more than 10 yards away from a green if it's likely that a shot that hits within 10 yards is going to get in there. So let's say you have a bunker near the green that sits 8 feet below the level of the green, and it's a steep downslope from the green edge down to the bunker, and it's 12 yards. So yes, it's more than 10, but a ball that hits 7, 8, 5 yards from the edge of the green is likely going to bounce right in that bunker anyways. We can include it. So it's kind of think of it as an effective 10 yards, not necessarily an exact 10 yards. So we're going to look at, in this case, you can see that how much of that greenside bunker on the left relative to the diameter of the green is within 10 yards. How much of the bunker on the right is within that 10-yard window as well. And we're going to average that or compare that against the overall diameter of the green. So in this case, we total the length of the red areas that we've stepped off within 10 yards and divide that by the green circumference, which can either be done by pacing around the entire green, or if you have a fairly circular green, you can just multiply the effective green diameter by pi. So if you have a calculator, a phone, whatever, just if your effective green diameter is 26, just do 26 times 3.14. That'll give you your circumference. So you can do it a lot quicker that way than having to pace around it. But either way, in this case, we're going to say that circumference of the green is 75. We have a total of 21 paces of bunkers that are closely bordering the green. So 21 out of 75 is 28%, which is basically between 1/4 and 1/2 of the green surrounded by bunkers. This is something that can occasionally be just eyeballed. If you just had a single bunker, let's say in this case, you took the bunker on the left out of play, there's no bunker on the left, just the small bunker on the right. I don't think anybody really needs to measure that. You can see that it's less than a quarter. So usually if it's less than a quarter or if it's like greater than half, they're pretty obvious to see. But if it's right at a quarter or, kind of on the borderline, you're going to have to do some measuring. So some common adjustments for bunkers. One would be bunker carry. When a player has to carry a significant bunker that protects more than half the green. As you can see here, almost the entire green is covered by this bunker. The player has to go over that bunker to get to almost the entire green. We're going to have a carry +1 adjustment. However, for scratch, to get this adjustment, they must have a green target of 5 or greater. Bogey gets it no matter what, but scratch has to have a 5 or greater green target to apply this. Basically, we're just acknowledging that the bogey golfer, is going to have more trouble with going over obstacles than scratch. If scratch has a 4 green target or a 3, it's not a tough shot. They're coming in from a fairly short distance where they're going to easily be able to carry it. And again, for the bogey golfer, it can be anywhere along the line of play with no minimum green target qualification. They don't have to have a 5. They can have a 2. They can have a 3. It doesn't matter. We also have depth. Depth is probably the most common adjustment for bunkers. How deep are the bunkers? Are they 2 feet, 3 feet, 5 feet, etc.? So how do we measure that depth? As you can see here, the depth of a greenside bunker is measured from points where most recovery shots are made to a height that would get the ball onto areas of the green where most holes are located. So it's not the deepest part of the bunker to the highest part of the green. It's not the shallowest part of the bunker to the shallowest part of the green. It's literally an average as much as possible. Where are balls likely to wind up in a bunker? Typically, they're going to wind up more towards the middle, especially if the bunker is kind of sloped where the sand is, deeper in the middle than it is in the sides. Where is it from there to get to where hole locations are going to be? Again, not the worst hole location, not the easiest, kind of more average. So we don't want to use extremes. We want to use more averaging. So as you can see here, we have a table that accounts for greenside bunker depth that starts at greater than 3 feet for men or greater than 2 feet for women. If a bunker is less than that, so if it's 3 feet or less or 2 feet or less for women, we say that's assumed. That's normal bunker depth. Very, very few bunkers are going to be flat. They're going to have some sort of depth, 1 foot, 2 foot. But until it gets to at least or greater than 3 feet for men or greater than 2 feet for women, then we don't have to worry about this. But once we get to those numbers, we're going to have either a +1, +2, +3, or +4, depending on how deep those greenside bunkers are. So as you can see in this image, this greenside bunker has various depths. Where is the player most likely going to be? They're probably not going to be 25 yards from the edge of the green on the very far right side of the picture where they're as deep as you can get. They're likely not going to miss the green by 25 yards, especially on a shorter shot. So you want to look more at the average where the bunker is likely to come into play, more towards the left side, the center of the green, the picture, not the very extremes. And then fairway bunkers. Fairway bunkers are really, we don't have a table for fairway bunkers. We just have an adjustment. So basically, we assume fairway bunkers exist on every hole. So when a player or when there are no fairway bunkers, we actually subtract a point. So it's one of the few times in the system where we subtract something when it doesn't exist, as opposed to adding something when it does exist. So as it says in the text on the screen, if you have a par 3 hole, a 1-shot hole, we reduce the table value by 1 because there's no fairway bunker on a par 3 hole if they're able to reach it in 1 shot. On a par 4 or 2 or more shot hole, we reduce the value by 1 if there are no fairway bunkers near a landing zone. Near meaning within 20 yards of a landing zone. Again, this is the same for scratch and bogey. So that bunker that's out there that's circled, maybe that's only in the bogey golfer's landing zone. Maybe bogey has a landing zone that's 15 yards away from that bunker. They get no -1 adjustment. Scratch is 50 yards past that bunker and nowhere near it. We would actually subtract a point from the scratch bunker rating. So basically, it's specific to a landing zone and specific to a golfer. We do have an adjustment called extreme, which allows us to add additional points when a bunker becomes more than just your standard, bunker. This is the church pews from Oakmont, where you're in that bunker, and not only are you dealing with the sand, you're dealing with these ridges of mounding, fescue that the ball might wind up in or near, or restrict your swing, or really have to get the ball up quickly to get out of them. So, as it says in the description to the right, if a punitive bunker feature makes recovery extremely difficult, pop bunkers, stack sod, extreme rough interferes with swing, etc., you can apply a +1. A +2 can be applied if that same thing applies, the same concept, except for the player really has to go out either sideways or backwards. So extreme +1 would be they can still hit a shot. They may get a decent amount of distance, but they're probably not getting all their distance. Extreme +2 would be they're just lucky to get out of there. They're probably not getting any distance towards the green. They're probably just getting out of the bunker, and that's their only real choice. To qualify for this adjustment, a bunker must be near the fairway landing zone or closely bordering the green. It has to be close enough to where the player is expected to be to apply this adjustment. So if this bunker was only 100 yards off the tee box, where not a single golfer is expected to be in a landing zone, you wouldn't be able to apply this adjustment because the players are not expected to be there. So we're going to do a quick example of a bunker rating here. We have a par 3 hole where the bunker fraction is between 0 and 1/4 or greater than 0 to 1/4. The green is surrounded by bunkers. However, due to the location of the bunker, it must be carried to reach more than half the green. That bunker in the front left is more than 4 feet, 4 feet average bunker depth, and it's a reachable par 3 hole for both the scratch and the bogey golfer. So what we would do is we would go to our bunkers section of our Form 1, and we'd first look at what is our green target. 5 for scratch, 7 for bogey. Between 0 and 1/4 of the green is surrounded by bunkers. That's going to give us a table value, if we go back to our table, of 3 for scratch and 4 for bogey. Now we're going to look at adjustments. So we have, in this case, we actually have 3 adjustments. The carry adjustment applies to both scratch and bogey. Scratch gets it because the green target is 5 or greater. Bogey gets it no matter what, so they both get the +1. The depth adjustment, it's greater than 3 feet for men, greater than 2 feet for women. So we're going to get the +1 adjustment, but it's not a +2. To get to a +2, it has to be greater than 6 for men or greater than 5 for women. So it just qualifies as a +1 depth. And then the last adjustment, which is the one most people, most beginner or even intermediate raters might miss, is that we have no fairway bunkers. Even though it's a par 3 hole, we don't have a fairway. We have no fairway bunkers. So we subtract a point in this case because the player only has to deal with bunkers on 1 shot as opposed to multiple shots. So our total adjustment then is a +1 because the 2 pluses and the 1 minus net each other out to be a total net of +1. So again, we don't want to just apply the pluses. We want to apply the pluses and the minuses, and then the total net value is applied. So in this case, we have a 4 for scratch and a 5 for bogey as our final numbers, with a carry, a depth, and an N adjustment. N means no fairway bunker. So all 3 of those codes have actually impacted our final rating. So we do want to write those in if we can. All right. Shouldn't have much longer, maybe another 25 minutes or so. Moving along here. Our next category is crossing obstacles. As I defined earlier, penalty areas, OB, extreme rough that has to be crossed. So those are the categories you're going to deal with. And the table values, the tables you can see there to the right, are based on the distance to safely carry that particular obstacle. So the left-hand side of the table, whether it's for men or women, is going to be for the scratch golfer. The right-hand side is going to be for the bogey golfer. And as you can see, the bogey numbers are quite a bit higher than scratch as they go up. But safely carry means we add an additional 10 yards of distance to the actual carry to ensure that they safely get over. So if the actual carry is 110 yards, we would say it's 120 yards of safe carry. So that's the number you apply to the table. So how long is the shot length to get over it? Like I said, 10 yards additional. If there are multiple crossings on a hole where the player has to cross over something more than once, we're going to take each one separately, evaluate it, use the highest value, and potentially apply an adjustment if there's multiple high values on a hole. We can also reduce a table value based on a partial or narrow crossing. Not every crossing is a full crossing where the player is, out of bounds or in the extreme rough or in a penalty area. They might have some areas where they could find the ball and actually play it. So we can reduce that value if that's the case. So here's an example of a penalty area crossing. Obviously, if the player doesn't get over, they're likely going to be hitting another shot from the tee again. So you would not reduce this one at all. You're basically either over safe or not safe. There's not a whole lot in between. This is an out of bounds crossing, pretty famous hole. you're, here in the old course, number 17, the road hole, player has to, a scratch golfer especially, to play this hole to reach in two or reach it comfortably in two, they have to go over the hotel area, which is out of bounds. Bogey might not have to go as far to the right, so you could percentage the bogey maybe down a little bit, but scratch would get probably the full value. And then this is an extreme rough crossing where the player has to get over a ravine with extreme rough where they're not going to be able to find it and play it. So, you probably give this one the full value as well. So this is where I was talking about where you could use a percentage, where this is a crossing to get to the fairway, pretty decent length crossing. But if the player happens to not get over it, they could lose the ball, could be in some of that deep, heavy brown fescue or some of the bushes that are there. They might lose it. Or they can wind up in some of the areas that are more open, maybe the sandy areas, and actually still be able to find it and play it. So you wouldn't want to give this crossing the full value, because this is not the same as if that was just pure extreme rough across the fairway where you had zero chance of finding and playing the ball. It would essentially be a lost ball. So percentage really is taken down, and usually we use quarters. So, 25%, 50%, 75%, et cetera. So if it's 50%, what that means is you're going to use 50% of the table value. So if the table value is an 8, 50% of that's a 4, that's your final number with the percentage. That's probably unlikely, but typically your table value is going to be more like a 4 or a 5. You might take a point off of it for a 25% chance of recovering and bring the 4 down to a 3 or bring the 5. So 50% is probably, the most you'll reduce it by. It's pretty rare to reduce it all the way down to 75% or take 75% off, because that means it's not much of a carry at all. The only exception to that would be if you have a partial crossing. So let's say that the player has something that crosses the fairway partially, but they can actually go away from it or actually play left or right of it without having to go over it at all. You could have a very small crossing number because the player only has to go over it for a very small portion of it. Maybe you only do give it a 25% of the table value rate. So, but typically when we're talking about being able to find and play the ball, 50% is probably the lowest you're going to go. So here's an example of a hole with multiple crossings. So we have extreme rough in 2 different areas, and we have the player has to hit to 2 different landing zones. So what we have is on the tee shot, it's a 535-yard hole for men, a 405-yard hole for women, so par 5. All the extreme rough in the hole is 100% lost. So the player has no chance of recovery in either of those extreme rough areas. On the tee shot, the crossing is 140 yards to safely carry for men, or 100 yards to safely carry for women. And on the second shot, from landing zone 1 to landing zone 2, it's 120 for men and 80 yards for women to safely carry it. So we'll go to our table, our crossing table, and crossing 1, again, we're only rating for bogey in this example, is going to be a 5. Crossing 2, a little bit shorter of a shot, a little bit shorter of a crossing, is going to be a 4. So our final rating is actually the 5. We're going to use the higher of the 2 numbers. So we don't average them. We don't, add them together. We definitely just use the higher of the 2. So in this case, it's just a 5. Any questions?
No questions.
Okay. And then our next category then is lateral obstacles. So again, using those same 3 categories, penalty area, OB, extreme rough, how they come into play laterally on a hole. Our tables there have the lateral columns in the middle of the table for men and women, and then their shot length to the left and the right of the table. So our ratings are based on how long of a shot the player has to reach the landing zone, whether it's the fairway or whether it's the green. The distance of the lateral obstacle from the center of the landing zone, which when we say landing zone in this case, we can mean the fairway or the green, because you can have a shot to the green that becomes the landing zone. And then any adjustments that would increase or decrease the chance that lateral obstacles come into play, and any recovery, potential recoverability they have from those obstacles. So one adjustment that's fairly new to the system, it popped up in 2019 with the change to the rules of golf, where it allows any area to be called a penalty area, even a area that has no water, never has had water in it. We had to kind of differentiate lateral obstacles by having out of bounds or extreme rough treated a little bit more harshly than penalty areas. So we have an adjustment called the K adjustment that adds 1 point when the area that's lateral is not a penalty area, where it's a stroke and distance penalty applied, such as OB, or ER, where the player is likely to lose the ball. So anytime you have a lateral obstacle that is a stroke and distance type penalty, again, OB, heavy, extreme, rough, we're going to add an additional point to the value. What we didn't want to have is two different tables. We didn't want to have a table for penalty area and a table for OB, extreme, rough with two different values. We just have a single table. So all we do is we add an additional point when it's truly the stroke and distance type situation. So this would be the same, even though it's not out of bounds. The player hits the ball into that heavy jungle, heavy, trees under, brush, etc. They're likely going to lose the ball. We would still apply that +1 because it's more than likely they're going to be taking a stroke and distance penalty. And then the bounce adjustment, this would be something that increases the chance that a ball might get to the out of bounds. We have a cart path. It could be sloping ground. Really, it's increasing the likelihood a ball will bounce into the obstacle. We would apply an additional point to the table value because it's a little bit easier to get to it than it would be if that cart path or that sloping ground didn't exist. We don't use this adjustment if the distance from the center of the landing zone to the lateral obstacle is less than 15 yards, because again, we're kind of maxing out the table value at that point. We also have the ability to subtract a point from the table if there's something that's preventing the ball from going into the lateral obstacle. So a fence, trees, bunkers, or another obstacle, any of these things can actually keep the ball from actually getting to the OB or the extreme rough, the penalty area. So in this case, we have a driving range to the right of the hole, and the ball that hits to the right there is likely going to hit that fence and bounce back in. So you wouldn't want to give this the full table. Likelihood that the player goes out is a little bit less than if that fence didn't exist. And then just like the crossing obstacles, we can use a percentage adjustment for lateral where the player might be able to find and play the ball. So we have this area here to the right of the fairway where, yes, there's a lot of spots in that area that the player could lose the ball or have to take an unplayable lie, those bushes and the ice plant, etc. But you wouldn't want to give this the full table value. You would want to look at the table value and then apply a percentage adjustment to reduce it a little bit. And then I mentioned this under the R&R category, but when we have a green that's partially or fully surrounded penalty area or water, we can apply this adjustment. This is basically how much of the green is surrounded by a crossing or lateral obstacle, and then how close is the edge of the green to that penalty area, OB, or extreme rough. So it's not just water. It could be extreme rough. It could be, OB. I guess there's not a lot of holes with OB surrounding the green, but how much of the green is surrounded and how close is it will give you a value anywhere and +2. 0 means there's no adjustment, but +1 or +2 would be an adjustment. For the scratch golfer, they must get a 5 or greater green target for this to apply. But for the bogey, any value, any shot, doesn't matter what their green target is, they would get this adjustment. So doing one more example here of a lateral obstacle rating, we have for the scratch golfer, in this case only, we'll just do it to keep it simple. We have a hole that's 465 yards long for men, 390 for women. The penalty area is 22 yards lateral on the tee shot. At the green, the penalty area is 18 yards lateral. This happens to be the 18th hole at TPC Soilgrass. Doesn't look exactly the same from overhead, but same hole. So in landing zone, table value off the full tee shot to a 22-yard lateral penalty area would be a 5. The second shot to the green, it's a shorter shot. It's only 30 or 25-yard shot for men, and then for women it's a 180. It's going to be a 5 as well. However, in this case, we have that adjustment where we have 2 or more values of 5 or greater. The 2 adjustment under both crossing and lateral says if you have 2 shots where their values are 5 or greater, you add them together. If they add up to be less or 11 or less, you basically give it a +1. If it adds up to be 12 or more, you give it a +2. So in this case, they add up to be 10. We're going to apply an additional point of adjustment. So the final rating in this case is going to be a 6. So 5 is the highest table value for either shot, but we're going to apply the +1 adjustment because it comes into play twice in a significant way. Questions on lateral obstacles?
No questions online. Colin?
Good here too.
Okay, good. All right, coming down the home stretch, just a few obstacles left, and these are, a little bit quicker than the previous ones. So trees. Trees are basically one of the more subjective categories in the system because trees are hard to, objectively evaluate because they're vertical, they're horizontal. Basically, they're all different. So what we're doing is we're evaluating trees based on the overall impact of trees on the play of the hole. How much are trees a problem? Are they minor, moderate, significant, or extreme? And is it a one-shot hole or a two or more shot hole? So basically, is it a par 3 or is it a par 4/par 5? So these values are kind of a subjective overall evaluation of trees in a hole. We're looking at a few things. Like I said, is it a one or two shot hole? What is the difficulty factor? As it says in the text there, trees are generally less of a factor on a one-shot hole. Typically on a par 3 hole, trees don't factor in much unless they're blocking the shot. If a player misses the green, they're usually able to hit the green without having to go over or under trees because they're so close to the green, it shouldn't be a big problem. But from fairways, from par 4s and par 5s, missing fairways and being in trees can substantially increase challenges. There are tweeners available, as you can see in the 2 or more shot hole row. It goes from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8. So those tweeners of 3, 5, and 7 are available if it's between minor and moderate or between moderate and significant, etc. So we didn't want to make the table so big that we had every number represented. So you have the ability to use that tweener value. So I'm going to go through these next 3 or 4 slides pretty quickly, but these are things that you would want to look at to determine the overall rating of trees on a hole. So the first thing is we do base it on a scratch golfer's ability. We want to be consistent with the way we approach tree recovery. So using the bogey golfer, who is not a very good player, who has more struggles with trees, is going to be hard because it just, you could get a bogey golfer who takes more chances, a bogey golfer who is very conservative. Scratch is going to be a lot more consistent. The key there is that the tree rating weighting for the formulas used in the calculation of the ratings is about twice as high for the bogey as it is for the scratch. So don't worry that you might get the same tree rating for scratch and bogey, a 4 and a 4 or a 3 and a 3. That's still having a much bigger impact on the bogey golfer in terms of the final calculations. So what we look at is the number, height, the density of the trees at mid-season. We look at things such as how long of a shot is the player hitting from the trees to get to the next target? Are they hitting a long shot? Are they hitting a short shot? How far are the trees from the center of the landing zone? Are they right next to the fairway, or are they, far enough away where, even a bad shot's not going to get to the trees very often? We don't have to measure the trees, but we have to keep in mind how far they are kind of in general from the middle of the fairway. We also look at the length of the shot required to reach the next landing zone or the green. Obviously, trying to hit a 3-wood or a long iron out of trees is much more difficult than a shorter shot where the player can just kind of hit, pitch shots and knockdown shots, etc. And then what kind of branches are involved? Are they low-hanging branches where the player has a difficulty even swinging the shot, swinging the club, or the branches cut up high enough where they can actually take a full swing and have a little bit of room to get the ball airborne without hitting some branches? And then what's underneath the trees is just as important as the trees themselves. So is it nice manicured rough? Is it, some sort of, tree bark or, the wood chips or stuff like that that might make recovery more difficult? Is it unmaintained where it's going to be undergrowth, where there's bushes and there's heavy rough? All those things can factor into how difficult the tree recovery is. And then what's between the trees and the target is just as important as well. So in this case, if the player's in the trees on the right-hand side of the pictures, the hole, they have to go over that penalty area to get to the green. So if they have to hit a low shot out of the trees and still have to carry over that penalty area, their likelihood of getting on the green goes down dramatically. So it's really what's along the line of play from the trees that might limit of the player being able to reach their target. So like I said, we use a scratch golfer's ability to recover from trees to even determine the bogey golfer's tree rating, because again, it's easier to visualize how a scratch golfer is able to recover from trees to be more consistent. But again, the bogey golfer gets a much higher weighting factor. So don't worry that your scratch tree ratings are not much different than your bogey. The bogey's still going to get, a higher rating overall. We do have a few adjustments for trees that come into play. One would be a shoot adjustment where the player has to hit the ball through a narrow shoot. This means the trees are on both sides and it gets pretty narrow between the trees. You would want to measure how long of a shot it is to get through that shoot and how wide is the shoot. In this case, we have an 18-yard wide shoot with a 95-yard shot to pass through it safely. There's a table under the trees page where it says shoot table. You would go to the table, and 18-yard wide shoot on a 95-yard long shot winds up with a shoot value of +1. This value can be as much as a +4, depending on how long and how narrow the shoot is. Another adjustment that doesn't require trees on both sides is an obstruct adjustment. So we have a shot from the middle of the fairway here. To get to the green, the player has to either go over or around these trees. So these trees are obstructing the shot to the next target. So we can apply that +1 obstruct adjustment in this case. This is applied on top of the overall tree rating of the hole. So what that means is you don't want to use this obstruct adjustment as a high table value and then apply the +1 on top of it. So it's almost like you're ignoring the obstruct in your overall evaluation of the trees, and then you're using the obstruct to apply a +1 on top of that. So in this case, maybe your tree rating is moderate, which is going to be a 4. The obstruct makes it a 5. That's your final number. You wouldn't want to say, oh, this obstructing tree makes these trees really difficult, I'm going to give it a 6 and then give it another +1 on top of that. You're kind of double dipping at that point. So going to do a quick tree rating here. We have a 450-yard hole for men, 340 for women. So it's a par 4, 2-shot hole for scratch, 3-shot hole for bogey to reach the green. So in this case, we're going to tell you that for the scratch golfer, the trees are moderate to significant, mainly the trees on the left that are pretty dense. Player might not be able to reach the green if they get in the trees. So we're going to give it a moderate to significant problem. But for bogey, we're going to give it a moderate problem. The reason we would do that in this case is that the bogey actually does not have to reach the green on their second shot. They're not expected to reach the green. They can't get there even without being in the trees. So the trees might not be as big of a factor because all they have to do is just kind of get the ball out of the trees to a reasonably close position to hit their third shot. And they're not going to be as impacted as a scratch golfer who is really trying to get to the green in 2 shots. So being in the trees in the tee shot really impacts the scratch more than it does the bogey. So if that's the case, we remember our table values. Moderate is a 4, significance a 6. So if we're going to go with the tweener value between moderate and significant, we're going to go with a 5. And then for bogey, just a straight moderate off the trees table is going to be a 4. And there are no adjustments in this case, so we're going to just leave it as a final value of 5 and 4. Questions?
No questions online.
All right, and our last 2 categories here shouldn't take more than 5 minutes each, so we should be wrapping up before noon your time. Green surface. Green surface is an evaluation of chipping and putting on each hole. What we're really looking at is the speed of the green and the contour, slope, or tilt of the green. So there's really just 2 parameters. On the left-hand side of the table, you can see the green speed determines which row you use on the table. And then the columns on the right are categorized into 3 different choices: relatively flat, or gently sloped, moderately contoured, or moderately sloped, highly contoured, or steeply sloped. So those do mean different things. The contour is how much undulation the green has. The slope is how much the green is pitched, meaning the ball rolls farther one direction than the other direction. So I'll talk about that here in a minute about how we determine that. But as you can see, you're only really choosing between 3 choices. Your green speed is likely going to be fixed all day. It should be fixed all day. You shouldn't have to stimp 18 greens on the golf course. Once you stimp a green or 2 and get a baseline speed, you can use that same speed for the entire day. So 99.9% of courses are going to keep their greens pretty consistent from hole to hole. So there's no reason to stimp more than a couple of greens to get a nice baseline. So really, you're only choosing between 3 values. Once you're in a row, once you're in, let's say, the 10-foot to 10-foot 11 row, you're choosing between a 6, a 7-8, or an 8-9. And that 8 and the 9 are based on bogey golfer values. So any number that's in a parentheses is for the bogey. The number without the parentheses is scratch. If there's no parentheses, it's the same value for scratch and bogey. So there are a few notes at the bottom of the table. As it says, the notes in parentheses are bogey ratings. A tiered green, a green that qualifies as tiered, has to be rated at least moderately contoured. So once you've given it a tiered adjustment for green target, you have to use at least the moderately contoured category in this category, in the green surface rating. relatively flat if the green has a tiered adjustment. And then note 3, a green divided into 3 or more circles due to contours or tiers is considered highly contoured. So if you had a 3-tiered green, you're highly contoured. You can't go to even moderate or flat. So how do we define these different categories? There are a little bit of subjectivity here, but relatively flat means just that. It doesn't have to be tabletop flat. It could have some break to it. It could have a little bit of movement, but it's nothing that the golfer won't be able to read and be able to kind of play for. Once you get to moderate, you're talking about potential multiple breaks. Maybe the ball is going to break a couple times before it gets to a hole. Maybe there are more severe slopes where the ball is going to break 4, 5, 6 feet as opposed to just a few inches or a foot. But nothing that the player is going to be totally clueless on. Now, once you get to highly contoured, now you might have multiple ridges, multiple mounds in the green where the player is going to have to read multiple breaks. It's not just a single break one direction. It's going to maybe break 2 or 3 times on a longer putt. Or those are steep enough that the ball is really going to pick up speed and be difficult to get the ball close to a hole location. So there's a second example of a highly contoured green, just a huge ravine or a huge kind of drop off in the middle of it. Even though the 2 tiers are relatively flat, that area between it is pretty severe, and you would want to give this a highly contoured category. So the second reason or second way to use this table is to use the sloped category. Gently sloped means that it's a less than 2-to-1 ratio of the ball rolling downhill versus uphill. Moderately sloped means it's between 2-to-1 to 3-to-1. And highly sloped or steeply sloped is greater than 3-to-1. Because so you could have a green here that's fairly flat. It doesn't have a lot of undulation, a lot of humps and bumps, but it's pitched from the back to the front. And that ball rolls much farther down the slope than back up the slope. You would want to determine what that slope ratio is. So in this case, if we say the stimpmeter reading is 9'2" based on the flat part of the green or a flat green, if this ball is rolling 15 feet down the slope, but only 7 feet back up that same slope for a majority of the green, we're going to have more than a 2-to-1 ratio of downhill to uphill. We're going to go ahead and give this a moderately contoured or moderately sloped category green. So even though this green doesn't have a ton of undulation, it's sloped to the point where the player is going to have difficulty judging speed uphill versus downhill. So we're going to give it that moderately sloped category. And then with the green speed of 9'2", it's going to give us a green surface rating of 6. Any questions on green surface?
No questions.
All right. And our last category, if I spend 5 minutes, I've spent 4 minutes too long, because psychological is something that you should not even have to do. The software actually does this automatically, so there's really no reason to do it. However, it's just good to be aware of how it works. Essentially, what we look at is the cumulative effect of other obstacles on a player's score. Any rating that you've given an obstacle of 5 or greater contributes to the potential psychological rating. So if you have at least 3 obstacles on a hole that are rated 5 or greater, we start to add up psychological points. Basically, it's saying that that hole is above average. It's more difficult than normal. We're going to have a player kind of a little bit more worried. So as you can see, you take all the values of 5 or greater, you add them up, and then you go to the table. So in this case, I've condensed all the rating values on the left to a scratch and bogey values. So the scratch golfer has 2 5s, 2 6s that add up to be 22. So 4 obstacles rated 5 or greater at 22 gives a 3 psychological rating. And for the bogey, we have 6 obstacles of 5 or greater that add up to be 36. So that gives off the table a 5 as a psychological rating. So essentially, we're using an objective process to come up with a psychological rating. Again, all done by the computer, the software, because it can read the numbers and know what to apply. But it's always good to know how it works, because again, you're giving a lot of high ratings. You realize you're also adding to psych as well. So it's just good to know. Any questions on psychological?
Again, no questions online, Colin?
Any questions overall? Because that was our last category.
Yes, sorry, we've got a couple questions in here.
Sure.
Hold on, just give me 1 second. It will be posted, the next Blue Coat email that goes out, the monthly email, it'll be posted in that one. Oh, Scott's presentation.
Yeah, we
Scott, I'll
can,
let you answer that question.
yeah, we provide this to any AGA that wants it. So, you know, and then you can distribute it as you feel fit.
Scott, can you just send it to me? John?
Sure, and then we can pass it out to those who want it.
Yep, no problem.
Question over here?
I've got a question about the overall impact of obstacles into the scratch rating. And what I've heard rules of thumb that distance is either 90 or 95% of the, do we have, if we're asked that question, say
Yeah.
from, do we have a number that we should cite as to how much distance impacts overall scratch course rating?
Yeah. If it depends on how you read the values or read the numbers, but it's probably 85 to 90% is distance, because that's the one thing that really does dictate scoring. The longer the hole is, the higher the score is in general. But what you got to take into consideration is that there's a yardage rating that is how much the yardage impacts the course rating, and then there's an obstacle rating. The obstacle rating for scratch is really small, and I'm talking, you know, sometimes as little as a few tenths. You know, it could be a couple strokes, it could be a few tenths. It could even be a negative number. The reason I say it could be a negative number is because we don't start with 0. We actually start with negative 4.9. So we're assuming there's at least 5 strokes of obstacle value on a golf course, or 4.9, just to get back to what we would consider assumed or average. So when you see an obstacle stroke value of 1.2, it means there's really like 6 strokes of obstacles out there. So you could do the math, and it's, you know, again, 90%, 90, whatever you want to call it. So.
Anybody else?
There was one question online, and maybe this was briefly covered at the beginning, but Scott, if you could just go over what's the difference between the course rating versus the slope rating.
Yeah, I didn't cover that because I didn't want to spend 4 hours in this seminar. But so basically, course rating is the scratch golfers, you know, the evaluation of the difficulty for a scratch golfer. So if the course rating is 72.0, means a scratch golfer is expected to shoot 72.0 on their, you know, better half or better 8 of 20 rounds, essentially, when they play well. So the slope rating is a measurement of relative difficulty, which is how much scores are spreading out for players who are not scratch. So the 113, hopefully most people in the room, if not everybody, knows 113 is our standard. When you have a course with a 113 slope rating, that means that the bogey golfer is expected to shoot 1 stroke higher than scratch for each stroke of handicap index. So if their handicap index is 12.0, they're expected to shoot 12 strokes higher than scratch on that golf course with a 113 slope. As slope goes up, let's say it's 125 or 130, that player's index of 12.0 gets corrected to like a 14 course handicap. So they're getting additional strokes because they find that course more difficult than it would for a scratch golfer. So if slope drops below 113, players actually can shoot less than a stroke apart from scratch, you know, relative to their handicap index. That typically happens on, you know, open, easy golf courses where scratch's advantage disappears. You know, scratch's biggest advantage is when the course gets tough, because they can still hit good shots, but the higher handicap players can't. But when you take that advantage away by making the course fairly easy, players can keep up with the scratch golfer, or better players in general, easier. So hope that makes sense.
Okay, anything else in the room?
Oh, all good here. I'm good.
All right.
Scott, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Always glad to help. And hopefully I didn't go too fast for the new people and not detail enough for the experienced people, but try to mix them both.
No, I think it was good.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Scott. And then obviously everybody, Greg, any closing remarks you want to make before we end the meeting?
Well, we still have a couple of things to take care of. We have John Donofrio and Mike Green are going to go over some stuff. John is just passing out some reference material. So I'm going to turn it over to John and Mike. And a little bit later, John Donofrio has a demonstration outside. I'm assuming it's not raining for anybody who wants to take a peek, and especially the new blue coats. So that's where we're at, Jody.
Okay,
John?
perfect. So Scott, you can
All right.
jump off. I know you need to go.
Yeah, I do. All right.
So-
Well, thanks
Yeah,
Hopefully I can
thanks,
be there,
Scott.
hopefully I can be there in person one of these years and do one of these in front of you guys.
Well, we appreciate it.
All right. You're welcome. See you later.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
All right, for those of you that have weathered the storm here, thanks for your cooperation. What we talked about is a lot of information here. And there's a few things that we wanted to highlight. I'm going to do a couple and then Mike's going to add a couple as well. One was around transition zones. He talked through it pretty thoroughly. But it did change for this year. Such that you weren't adjusting a transition zone value. And that was when, and let's put a context on it. There's the yardages, and he showed the transition yardages that are calculated. So for a bogey men golfer, they hit a 200 off the tee, 170. So that's 380 yards. If it's a 390-yard hole, it is calculated to be in that transition zone. They might be able to get there because they can get up to an additional 20 yards in those two shots, but it's calculated as that. It can actually change if there's roll points or something, a large slope in front, some reason why they won't get that additional roll. They can't get that additional roll. It might take it out of transition, and if it becomes a team. A rating team determination when they look at what the actual hole looks like for that course that's calculated to be in a transition zone, and then determine whether they think that it'll never get there 0% of the time, and then they would actually create a new landing zone, or 100% of the time, and they'd use that larger number. Anything between that becomes transition and uses that transition zone value. If they determine that they can get to the middle of that green 50% or more, then they actually just use that value. If they think that they can get there, but only 1% to 49%, then they're actually going to use that value, but they're going to additionally have another landing zone set of information, whether it's bunker or lateral penalty areas or other things like that. So those things are a little bit different than what we did before. We would say, they can only get there 25% of the time. So we'll take that transition and a 25 effective diameter of a 5, and we'll reduce it to a 4 because they can only get there 25% of the time. Going forward, what we're doing is just saying, the USGA is saying, just use that code because it's already assumed that it takes into account the occasion when they get there and the occasions when they don't get there, and it's averaging a long shot and a short shot. Does that all make sense? The other thing that we wanted to talk about, or I wanted to talk about, was about forced layups. He talked a little bit about forced layups and how there's dogleg and forced layups and layups by choice. I'm just going to kind of focus in on the forced layup. We see, and he talked through exactly how it works. If there's some obstacle in front that you can't get there because it's in your landing zone, whether it's a deep bunker or a penalty area or high rough or some other thing that impedes the ball from getting there, both flight and roll, that player is forced to lay back. Tends to be 10 yards. If it was a steep slope down to the water, it would be more than 10 yards. But it's actually what you're forced to do. You can, if that's a tight area, you can actually have the player, you can determine that the player or the team that the player would play back even further than that, say another 10 yards or another 20 yards to a better shot. That additional yardage would factor into the shot going into the green, but it wouldn't factor into the length of the hole. The length of the hole is still just the forced, adding just the forced layup portion, say 10 yards or 20 yards. it's also an area that we see a lot of, when he was talking about the course rating form, the Form 1. It tends to be one of the places that we have a lot of errors in there because there's 4 pieces to what you have to record. One of them is that actual forced layup yardage that you would put in that, forced layup dog leg area. A second part of that is the fairway width. Because you're forced to hit less club, say instead of hitting driver, you're going to hit a 3-wood or a hybrid. They take into account that when you're using less club, you can actually hit an area because of dispersion a lot easier. So there's a layup adjustment, an L-1, that you actually apply. So say the fairway was 25 yards wide. Each time you'd have a 25 wide L-1, you get 1 point less. So if that table value was say a 4, it would be a 3 value when you're laying it up to that. Even though it's a forced layup, you're using less club. So that logic carries over into the R&R as well, where you get that L-1 that goes into the R&R for the same reason. You have less likelihood of being in that rough or any other area around that. There was one more, and I've forgotten it while I was standing up here. Oh, I guess I did mention it, which was once you've recorded that forced layup of yardage, you factor that into that distance that your approach shot is to the green. So you're laying it up 20 yards and you had a 50-yard shot into the green. Now you have a 70-yard shot into the green. So I think that was it. Any questions on either of those two? Yes. Oh, no. Sure.
Do they take all these factors we do when you do the course rating and they put that into a computer program that comes up with the slope and the course rating? Is that?
Yes. So mention the course rating form, that's called a Form 1. There's also a Form 2 and a Form 3, and it takes that information that we collect at the golf course, and then it has a series of formulas, that algorithms that create the actual course rating and actually a bogey rating. The bogey rating and then the relationship between those two with formulas for distances applied becomes a slope. Yes. Sure.
In your case with the forced layup or dog layup, but overall, even though you're going to have a longer shot into the green, the effective length of the hole still remains the same.
Exactly. Well, it gets adjusted.
Okay.
It still say was a 380-yard hole. It's still 380 yards, but then they're going to add in through the formulas in the USGA software. They'll add in that 20 yards.
Gotcha.
So the effective playing length of the course gets longer, but the actual hole length does not change.
That's only a forced layup, not a
Correct.
choice.
Yeah, not the layup by choice,
Forced layup.
just that.
I know that this is supposed to be the mid-season. What about the spring out here where we back up our drives and, there's a bunch of wind?
Yeah, we when we go out on the course rating, we spend a lot of time with the pro as well as the superintendent to talk about how they maintain that golf course and what their rough heights typically are mid-season form, what the fairway firmness and green firmness are, what their speeds are. So we try and do as much as we can to get to what that actual
spring fall.
Right.
You get less roll, yeah, that's just,
Okay.
they don't make any adjustments.
You can't go up in the spring and come down in the season,
Especially in North Shore, it's so cold and wind and everything and.
right on the lake.
There's nothing,
Mike was going to cover a couple of items.
it might be worth it.
I thought they do PCC now.
I think my main point is this is totally overwhelming for people who have just started. And it's, our effectiveness is really the product of the interchange between the people who are new and the people who are experienced and working together. We've got a really great team and doing these things. It's a little different than being put on the fifth hole and waiting to see if anybody goes out of bounds, and then you can't tell them because they've hit a provisional ball, and you sure as hell don't want to say, you know, it's in rough that's 3 feet high and you can't possibly hit it out. So, or is it the par, you know, or is it the Titleist 5 I have in my hand? That kind of stuff. So we'd like to have for the experienced people, this is a wake-up call, because normally we go to sleep kind of during the winter, and then we're waking up and we have a little bit of a new system and we're going through it in detail. There's not much change on what we have here. So I'd like to address it a little bit from a higher level. I can address some other questions. We did have a question, I know, on what about that area right off the fairway? Okay. Now, normally there's a little cut on the side. Okay, 1/2 of that on each side is included in the width of the fairway. So it's not like we forgot it. Okay, it's usually playable just like other things. And I think each of you got this thumbnail sketch. Okay, I'd suggest that you go through it. I'm not going to go through it right now, but it shows you that there's a whole set of things that have to do with the effective playing length of the course. That's the main thing. And the other thing is all of these obstacle factors, 10 of them. Some of them are relevant for a particular course, some aren't, and they're relevant in different kinds of ways. But when you interact, I know this is my own experience, when we interact with clubs we're rating, and I'll even start with my own club when I talk to somebody who's head of golf greens and other person that's playing in charge of the golf activity. It's very important on the course rating end to reflect the broadness of what it is we do, how it's done, and that all of these different factors impact the course rating and slope. And in particular, I would say, several of you, I know we have right now, Andrew Green looking at our course, and there's bound to be something that gets suggested, and I can say it ain't going to change anything unless we change dimensionally the long length of the course. It may be a different course. It may be something that you'd recognize more in 1920 than you do today. But all of these things come into play. They also come into play when you're talking about the allocation of handicaps, holes for handicaps. And there are some very specific kinds of guidelines. We try not to get into that discussion. We very much will take and provide those resources, references to them, to the individual clubs. Each one looks at it slightly differently. And I can say for sure that if you have the committee that's looking at allocating those things, and usually it's don't do the real low numbers at the end, blocks of 3, you all know how that works. One of the things is I can tell you 2 scratch players see the course differently, because one of them hits it 1,000,000 miles and can't hit the irons as well and may not putt as well. And there's another one who hits it 250, hits it on the green almost all the time, and is a great chipper and putter. They see what's difficult differently than that. So it's best we stay away from that. But if you familiarize yourself with these basic principles, you're going to have a really good start And you're going to have a lot of people, if you work on, we have kind of some practice things to get going. And if you work on that, there are going to be plenty of people to help you get to be better, faster. I will also say that when we look at what's up here, these are common mistakes. I'm not going to tell you what the detail is to fix them. That's not what I wanted, my point. My main point is that there's some big mistakes and there's some big areas that very commonly happen. At the end of the day, the team leader gets one of these for every single set of tees that got done. And then they're trying to make a meal out of what's written on the piece of paper. So we like to have things that are as accurate as possible. If there are questions, ask, and have some basic principles. We are not trying to, when we do this, we are trying to do first the very best job we can to fairly rate the course. We are not trying to produce the maximum number that might happen under some unusual circumstances. That's not the point. The point is a course rating and slope for an individual course. If the players at that course can't play to that, and they take it in their league play and go somewhere else, they're going to lose. So there's no benefit to it. The scratch player, it's the course rating. The bogey player who's playing, it's some modification of the impact of slope on that. And then you remember that all of that goes into something that produces the handicap. And there's a range of adjusted things that will keep you with exactly the same handicap. So let's take a little bit here. We talked about the topo. The main thing is don't remember par threes are 0 unless we have elevation change, and the topo numbers, unless you saw the thing with the big up and downs, unless that's really big up and down, the numbers aren't too bad. The fairway width, when you're talking about that, when you approach the green, even though you have it, it's tempting to use the absolute end because we know that the fairway very often going into the green goes from 25 or 30 yards down to about 10 or 12. So you grab 10 or 12, 10 or 12 produces a number off the charts. It's not representative because not everybody gets there. Better to blend it in there. When you're looking at the green target, we know greens are different shape and how we do it. And what we're trying to do is to say, if we have this surface area that's here, how can we best convert it into something that gives us an oval or a series of ovals in how we do it. Again, it's not make it the biggest, but we're seeing a lot of greens now where you've got corners cut out, but they're part of the green. And then you're sort of thinking about, well, how do I cut that off? And maybe I can patch that on over here. And the other part of the greens is, how close is it to the front? In all of this, when we're looking at objectives, obstacles, the stuff that's towards the back of the green or on the sides comes into play far less. Yeah, I found a 8-foot deep, I find it at Chicago Golf, I can tell you, but I found myself, an 8-foot bunker in the back, and you have to, but all the ones in the front are only 3 feet. Is that really representative? So there's common sense in this, and that's experience-based. That's things you're going to learn about and be able to do. Bunkers, we talked about that, and we're talking about where are they? We know the bogey golfer, more often than not, is using the bunker that comes out of a slice. It's the ball to the right. Everything being equal, doesn't mean that's the basic rule, but if you've got deep bunkers in certain places that people have it, or you see that there are drop-offs on the green that are very likely to come up with the 80 or 90% of the players that don't get to the middle of the green, then those are a lot more important in how we do the rating. Crossing obstacles, we saw how all of that was done. It's tempting also to say we've got a 10-foot wide or 15-foot wide creek that's out towards the end of the tee box. And so we do a 220-yard crossing for the scratch player on that. Well, wait a minute. What happens to the area from this side of the creek back to where I'm tee? Is it rough? Is it fairway? So for a lot of things for the bogey golfer, it's an unfair representation of what the value of that is, because they may not even get there. And if they don't get there and they're still in the fairway, their life is not over. It's a different kind of thing in terms of adjusting those. So as you look at trees and as you look at bunkers and that kind of thing, I know you all have a lot of experience, a lot of other places. Think about how that works, because you'll be more effective in working with us, and we'll be more effective in doing an A+ job, which is what we're trying to do. Trees, I talked about the lateral. We do see things in lateral, particularly at the greens, where you've got a big bush. If you're in that bush, man, you're dead. It's almost like lost ball. But here's the thing, 8 feet in diameter, and that's the only one that's there, and all the rest of the green doesn't have anything. Does that really measure the proportionality of the value for it? So there are some of those things that you'll see, and it's going to be, I know that from the questions I heard, and they're very good questions, that you'll see this, and you're going to be more effective in explaining the thing to other people. That's as soon as you find yourself and you're in here and you can talk a little bit about this with somebody at your club or some other place, you're going to be happier and you're going to be a lot more effective in dealing with your club. Green surfaces we talked about, and in trees, I know there's a bunch of there are a number of places around here that have quite a bunch of trees, but for me, the maximum trees I always run into were in the Pacific Northwest and up in Maine, where when you're talking about trees, you're really in the trees. So that's it. And the major challenges for us, these yardage adjustments, we don't take lightly, because we know that's the thing that hits the thing. We talked about transition. You got everything you need. We double check them, and don't leave empty blanks on the form, because that means, and don't write in permanent ink if you don't know what the number is. And don't write in a pencil that we can't Xerox, so because we pass them on to everybody. So that's it. Those are my thoughts, and thank you very much for coming.
Well, again, I want to thank all of you for coming, and those of you that are zooming in. We do have a presentation by John out in the back, especially for the newer guys and ladies, that just to take a look at how you go about the process of rating a hole or so. 2, right, John? Out back. And you have questions after this, please email any of the team leaders, myself, Colin, John, and we'll get back to you. And we look forward for you to signing up on ratings, because that's probably the easiest way to learn the process. We learn in steps. We don't go from here to here. We go very slowly. But it doesn't take more than 2 or 3 to really get what the format is, and having you getting into some of these decisions that you've heard being made today. If your name is not in the course ratings, Colin, we need to get this gentleman. Yeah. So next time these things come out, they come out once a month. So then your name will probably and exactly know where you live. But we have the north, central, northwest, and south section. We try to put you in there, and you will get, if there's some rating south and you live south, then you can then sign up for it.
There's here.
It should be 3.
You volunteer, you click on volunteer here. Yeah, there's tournaments, sunshine golf, or ratings, and ratings come out once a month. And they're put in there in the system specific to close to where you live, so that we're asking you to drive 2
Or
hours.
semi-close to where you live.
But there's generally, you get on the list, an email will come out, John Petrarca will tell you, go sign up, and then you pick the ones that you can do, and we hope you pick many.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Are on a team.
It depends on where we're at. We can do as small as 5. Because you'll do a male tee, you'll do a female tee, and then somebody will do the greens. It's generally 6. If we're doing a golf course that has multiple sets and they're spread out, we may have to have people on 3 sets of tees into the green, and it gets up to 7 or so. So it just depends. You know, if we're doing a public course that hasn't changed for 25 years, you could probably get away with 5. If we're doing a private country club, that's probably not going to work. Anything else? Thank you all for either listening or coming. When is the June rating the June requests will be coming out in a week or 2, right? Yeah, in a week or so. And we'll make sure that you get on the list for the email and on the list so you can sign up. And other than that, thank you for coming.